Text my son, he was trying to call me and tell me. Okay, I'm calling the meeting to order. I'm Tom Smith. I'm the vice chair of the committee. And the first thing on the order is to vote on the approval of the agenda. We have the agenda here. Does anybody want to make any additions or deletions to the agenda? You move to approve? Give me a second.
I'll second.
Okay, any further discussion? Hearing those, I call for a vote on approving the agenda. All those in favor say aye. Anybody opposed? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. The minutes were sent out for both the September 25th and October 9th meetings. I think we had an issue. We couldn't approve the September ones because of a quorum issue, I believe. So I know we need to technically vote on them one at a time. I want somebody to make a motion to approve the minutes from September 25.
One question. I had one minor change to one of them. I can't
You know
remember
which one it was.
It was the minutes from October on
October,
page 4 in the second paragraph, the second to last sentence. It reads Brunswick County. It should be Brunswick River. So if you want to make a motion.
When
to
we
approve-
get this, that one, you make a
Okay.
motion to approve as amended.
Okay.
So let's do the September one. Somebody make me a motion.
I'll make the motion.
Okay, in a second. And we got a second. Any further discussion on the September 25th minutes? Hearing none, I call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Hearing none, the minutes for September 25 are approved. Now we come for approval of minutes of October 9. And the best thing for you to do is make a motion to approve with the amended wording.
I'll make a motion to approve with the amended wording on page 4 to state project.
Okay. And we got a second right here. Any further discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, I call the question. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed? Hearing none, we are approved for the minutes. And that brings us to the presentation of the draft Eastern Oyster Fishery Management Plan Amendment 5.
Tom, if it's all right with you, since we have a couple of new commissioners,
Okay,
2 committee members.
everybody go around and introduce themselves.
Yeah, I feel like that would be.
Okay, that is a good thing to do. I'll start myself. Tom Smith, I live in Weddington, North Carolina. I'm the mayor pro tem of Weddington. I have a 50-ton license and a recreational fisherman. We have a house in Oak Island.
Glenn Skinner, live here in Carter County, a lifelong commercial fisherman, actually worked at the division for about 3 years and currently the executive director of North Carolina Fisheries.
My name is Pam Morris. I am associated with the commercial fishing industry. I live down east in Smyrna, and that's all you need to know about me.
You can do a lot with the waterfowl museum.
Yes, I work for the Courtside Waterfowl Museum.
Ken Siegler, lifelong commercial fisherman. I'm from Bear Creek community, Oslo County. Sitting on a lot of committees on these for years and years and years.
I'm Mike Upgard. I'm a charter captain out of Topsail Beach, North Carolina.
Sam Boyce, recreational fisherman out of Wilmington, North Carolina.
Michael Yates, recreational fisherman. I live in Hubert, and I started this actually to meet a requirement for my degree. I'm still sticking around.
Would you like?
I'd like the staff to introduce themselves. I think that's good for our members and the audience.
I'm Lorena. I'm a biologist out of the Manual office.
Jeff Dobbs. I was a biologist out of the Moorhead City office. Now I'm the fishery management plan coordinator. So kind of shifting roles.
Joe, biologist in the Wilmington office.
I'm Bennett. I'm a biologist in Moorhead City office.
And I'm Jesse Bissett. I'm the Marine Fisheries Commission liaison, and I'm here in the Moorhead City office.
Coral, I'm a marine fisheries program assistant, so I just help Jesse out.
Chris Stewart, biologist supervisor in the Wilmington Regional Office and committee staff.
Okay. Now with that, I guess we can begin with the presentation, unless you have something else for me.
We do have, Dr. Sharp online.
Oh, that's right. Dr. Sharp is online and somebody else probably.
That's actually me.
Oh, that's you.
Hey, everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Fred Scharf and professor of fisheries biology at UNCW. And I'm sorry I can't make it in person tonight. My wife's mom is having some health issues, so she's having to tend to that. And so I'm just wrestling teenagers over here. So, but I'm here virtually and in full spirit.
Okay.
And
Here's our last member. Introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Jeremy Skinner, representing Commercial Efficiency.
Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank
You hadn't missed much.
Perfect.
We have approved the agenda and the minutes. And we're getting ready to have the presentation this time.
do you mind if I say one additional thing?
You may.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. So, at your last meeting, and the meeting in September, we talked about how there had been a court case in April that called into question whether or not virtual participation in advisory committee meetings would be allowed, and if the votes that any virtual members cast, if they would actually be able to be counted or not. Since then, in fact, just very recently, we've received additional guidance from the Department of Justice, and we are able to allow virtual attendance and virtual voting for advisory committees now. So while we still very much appreciate everybody trying their best to get here in person, we do think that people will be allowed to, or people are allowed to vote virtually now.
This week. Oh, I'm sorry.
But I know just me personally, I love seeing y'all in person, so.
Okay.
And that's it, I swear, Tom.
So we are allowed now. That's different what we have in our town. Our interpretation was you had to be present.
Red counts.
So
Yes, is that just for advisory committees?
it's probably just for.
It's currently for advisory. The guidance we received from the DOJ is because the recommendations that the advisory committee makes, it's not anything binding.
Yeah.
That there is a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay. Makes good sense to me. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, now can we have the presentation of the draft Eastern Forester Fishery Management Plan Amendment?
I can't think of anything else to hold it off any longer, so yeah.
Okay.
I can think of one thing, just as a preface from the lead, just reminding folks where we're at today and what we're looking for today is, the draft amendments have been sent from the MFC for public and AC comment. The plans have been developed. Right now, we're looking for feedback from this group on these amendments. We're not trying to rehash how the issues were developed or how the documents were written. We're just looking for your feedback on it.
Which committees have seen this already?
Just the northern.
Just the northern? Okay.
All right. So I'll go ahead and start again. My name is Bennett Paradis. I'm a biologist in the Morehead City office. I'm one of the co-leads for this plan. Joe Fishendala is the other co-lead for Amendment 5 of the Eastern Oyster Plan. So today we're going to talk about the proposed management strategies within the current draft of Amendment 5. After we present these ideas, we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. So Jeff touched base on this a little bit, that for perspective of where we are in that currently in the FMP process, we've got a timeline here. So back in July, we held a 3-day advisory committee workshop. And since then, we've incorporated edits to make this current version of the plan. So then the MFC has voted to send this out for review. So this advisory committee is one of 4, which will review the draft of Amendment 5 to the Oyster Management Plan and vote on recommendations. Following discussion and review held during these ACs, the MFC will then select preferred management options, and the draft amendment will be sent for DEQ, Secretary, and legislative review. So tonight, the main discussion will be on the issue papers and the preliminary management recommendations proposed by DMF. This stage in the process allows for further review and discussion of ideas for management strategies concerning oysters in North Carolina. So the amendment itself is comprised of a base plan that provides background information on the biology of the species, a description of the fisheries, an economic impact summary, and an overview of the oyster resource as an important habitat. There are also a few appendices that provide further detail on DMF management policies and enhancement programs. The management strategies that are proposed in the recreational harvest issue paper and the mechanical harvest management issue paper are the topics that we'd like to focus on tonight, as these are areas we have focused on revising with this amendment. So we're just going to focus on 1 and 2 for tonight. And so I'll start with Appendix 1, which is the recreational shellfish harvest issue paper. The number of recreational shellfish harvesters in North Carolina is currently unknown, which makes it extremely difficult to estimate the total recreational harvest. This is an issue that has been acknowledged in all past Eastern and Heartland plans. And so there's an inability to accurately estimate the amount and extent of recreational harvest in the state. Due to the widespread accessibility of intertidal oysters and clams along North Carolina's coast, the potential impact for recreational harvest could be significant. And so this is a potentially large data gap in planning's information. The division is striving to establish the best data sources across the fishery to complete stock assessment. Given that North Carolina's shellfish fisheries are exclusively under state jurisdiction, a lack of recreational harvest data makes it extremely difficult to address potential management issues such as harvest limits, size limits, and gear restrictions for the recreational fishery. North Carolina and Virginia are the only 2 states without some form of license, local permitting, or residency required for recreational harvest for shellfish. Another concern for not having a license requirement for recreational shellfish harvest is the inability to easily communicate health concerns associated with harvest from temporarily or permanently closed polluted areas. So shellfish harvest areas are highly regulated by NCDMF Shellfish Sanitation Section for human health and safety. This section is responsible for classifying all coastal waters as to their safety for shellfish for human consumption. Within coastal waters, areas are classified as approved, conditionally approved, restricted, or prohibited. These classifications are used to keep consumers safe and healthy. As no license is required for harvest, participants are often unaware of stipulations and/or closures and are unable to be targeted with educational material. Having a separate license or having a separate license for recreational harvest could automatically link to essential information updates on safe shellfish harvest areas. So in summary, creating a specific recreational shellfish permit would allow DMF with a complete pool of recreational harvesters. That list could then be used as a survey frame to help determine the effort in the fishery, as well as the total harvest that occurs. This would allow for distribution of educational materials and information at the point of sale to any potential recreational harvesters. Additionally, having a list of the population of recreational shellfish harvesters would also be useful to distribute closure proclamation and maps. So if a shellfish species gets added to the already existing CRUFL, then the activity survey during the sale of the CRUFL would still need to be conducted to identify those fishers that participate in recreational shellfishing. And then those participants could be sent additional surveys to determine effort and harvest estimates for the recreational shellfish fishery. In order to pursue any of these potential solutions, a significant amount of time and effort will need to be expended by DMF to assess internal program and resource capabilities as well as limitations. Any potential desired legislative changes require a specific process and are ultimately outside the control of DMF or the MFC. So to best solve this issue, DMF proposes that the division ultimately explore potential options and solutions outside the FMP fishery management process. So with that, we'll go ahead and segue into Appendix 2. I'll hand it over to Joe for the mechanical issue paper.
So I'll give you an overview of what we've outlined for mechanical oyster harvest management. In the draft FMP, there's a lot of detail in this section, so, this presentation will kind of give you the high level overview. If you have questions on kind of the details, kind of how we got to some of these management approaches, we can go over that in the discussion, and I have plenty of information and some extra slides. Addressing mechanical harvest management for North Carolina basically requires us to balance the value of harvesting oysters as a fishery resource while maintaining their role as an essential habitat, not only for themselves, but for a wide range of estuarine species. And so mechanical oyster fishing gear is very efficient at removing oysters. So we have to be careful with kind of managing to ensure we're not damaging the habitat excessively. And so the origination of this issue is kind of looking at three pieces that we're kind of trying to address. The first was concern from the commercial industry of how we're currently managing the mechanical harvest fishery and kind of some complaints they have with how the trigger sampling is done. The second is kind of finding a way to solidify our current culture planting strategy into the fishery management plan process. And third is that the Commission's Coastal Habitat Protection Plan identified mechanical harvest gear as kind of reducing impacts from mechanical harvest gear as a goal of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. So we're looking at that impacts of mechanical gear in the oyster fishery in this FMP. So the existing mechanical harvest management strategy for oysters of Pamlico Sound aims to monitor the habitat condition of oyster reefs while mechanical harvest is actively happening in real time, and then react to close broad management areas once the condition of the oysters reaches a point where the effort required to harvest those legal oysters is causing excessive damage to the reef habitat. And so when this management strategy was developed and adopted, participation was much greater in this fishery, approximately 5 times than what it is right now. And so it was much easier for the division to go out and actually find people. There was a lot of people out there, so when we go out and do the sampling, it's pretty easy to find where the fishing is actively occurring. In recent years, with the drop in participation, it's been harder for the division to actually go out and sample where the fishing is actively occurring. So we're having to use kind of our best judgment and knowledge of kind of what's out there, as well as kind of historical fishing activity, as well as currently a lot of the fisheries occurring in those shallow bays, and they're limited to a 6-week season, and there's a break in that season. And during that break, there's no fishing going on. So if sampling is to occur, there is no fishing activity going on out there. And sometimes, the varying conditions between oyster reefs in the region, the harvesters kind of feel that we may not be actively sampling locations that are representative of where they're fishing. And so now, the potential mechanical harvest season for oyster could run November through March. However, what the actual length for the mechanical harvest that occurs in each season is determined by our sampling. So these areas are open and closed by proclamation. And with fluctuations in the oyster resources often impacted by storm events, the season length in any given year could be wildly different than the year before. So oftentimes, the trigger sampling occurs in an oyster season is 4 weeks, when the year before it was 6-10 weeks. So there's a lot of variability, and it also closes oftentimes. We issue a proclamation and it can close no sooner than 72 hours of issuance. Let's see. So at the beginning of each mechanical harvest season, harvesters don't know how long the season's going to be. So it's potentially could run the entire season, or it could be very short depending on the actual resource out there. And so this causes a lot of uncertainty with that variable potential season length for the harvesters. So historically, the next piece that we're looking at is addressing those habitat concerns from mechanical harvest gears that were identified in the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan and directed by the Marine Fisheries Commission for us to kind of look at ways to reduce those impacts. So historically, deep water reefs in Pamlico Sound reached up to 13 feet off the bottom. So there were some pretty high reliefs out there, relief reefs, that's a tongue twister, out there. And kind of historic fishing activity, over 100 years ago and through the current times has really kind of reduced the height of those reefs. And kind of that mounded structure was a much better habitat with higher complexity for both oysters living on there, as well as, all finfish and other shellfish species out there, crabs, shrimp, etc. And another piece of this, currently when we have these low dissolved oxygen events from storms, kind of that low dissolved oxygen water where things can't live is kind of focused in that deeper portion of the sound. And since oysters can't move and get out of the way, if the reefs don't reach a height off the bottom above that water where there's no dissolved oxygen, they die. And so we see this on our current sanctuaries where, there's one, 22 feet deep and coming off the bottom, kind of those lower oysters on the bottom from about 22 to 14 feet die when we have those low dissolved oxygen events, but the oysters on the top survive. The shells are still there, and then their spat settle down and kind of repopulate. In the deeper portions of Pamlico Sound, those kind of high relief areas have been kind of scrubbed down to become these low relief shell piles, kind of shell hash. As you can see in the picture on the right, that's kind of the degraded shell hash reef. And on the left is kind of a higher relief, healthy reef in the deeper portion of Pamlico Sound. So kind of the long-term potential survival and even recovery of deep water reefs in Pamlico Sound really relies on them being able to gain some height off the bottom to get above that layer of water that doesn't have any dissolved oxygen in those storm events. Not only the height of reefs in Pamlico Sound have been reduced, but the overall area of amount of reefs in Pamlico Sound have been reduced. And we know this from kind of historic mapping of Pamlico Sound where there were reefs found. When we go out there and sample now, they've either completely disappeared or they're just kind of reduced to that shell hash rubble. And they've really shown a decrease in height through time too, when they were kind of shown to be, up to 2.5 meters tall off the bottom in 1868. Now, in 1993, when they went back and looked at them, they were less than a meter, under potentially a half meter. And even now, when we go back out there, there's even less. And these declines in reef height and area has been attributed to decades, kind of almost centuries now of fishery effort. So in areas that are open to mechanical harvest in Pamlico Sound, we have been planting culture material out there. So hard material, either rocks or oyster shells, that spat can settle on and kind of grow and form new oyster reefs. But you can see these dots, the yellow triangles and blue squares, are showing our different culture planting sites. They're pretty much focused entirely around the perimeter of the sound in the shallow bays, with no culture planting effort to kind of restore any of that material that's been lost in those deep water reefs out in the middle there. So there's been no culture planting effort out in those deep water areas to kind of help mitigate any loss of shell or kind of height from those fishing effort out there. So we do have a really extensive culture planting program. I think the largest culture planting program for harvest of oysters in the country. And so between 2000 and 2022, we've planted over 2.1 million bushels of culture material in areas that are open to mechanical harvest of Pamlico Sound. And if you compare that to what's been harvested across that time, only around about 500,000 bushels of oysters were mechanically harvested actually under that. So this resulted in 4.8 times more bushels of culture being planted in areas that were mechanically harvestable than oysters that were harvested. But this only applies to kind of those, the culture is only planted in those shallow areas and not in those deep water areas. And kind of if you zoom in even closer, since 2018, we've kind of really ramped up our culture planting program through greater funding. we've planted 36 times more bushels of culch in Pamlico Sound in areas open to mechanical harvest than has been harvested. And again, we don't know, there's not a direct one-to-one correlation of what we put out to what can be harvested. We don't know what that ratio is, and it likely varies across the sound. Some areas that are muddier or, you know, more flow, different growth rates, culch getting buried. It's probably variable. And but we do know that some of these reefs have been observed to yield harvest on them for decades. So some of the ones that were planted in the 80s, if you go up there now, there's still oysters there. But our current management approach doesn't distinguish culch planted oysters from naturally occurring reefs. So up there right now, an oyster on public bottom is an oyster, whether it was a wild one or one that resulted from culch planting. So again, the culch planting effort in Pamlico Sound has exceeded harvest removal. Sorry, I'm trying to choke to death. Got through a lot of these, but so currently, with that kind of how we're vastly exceeding the culch, that's the amount of harvest with our culch planting. There may be kind of some room there for us to better utilize our culch planting program for mechanical harvest. To kind of maybe focus more harvest on our culch planted reefs and take some of the pressure off potentially the wild reefs. So the potential management that's outlined in this appendix, there's kind of 3 strategies we've developed. One is deep water oyster recovery areas, kind of known as DORAs. In this, the strategy, the habitat value of those reefs in this strategy is prioritized over the fishery value. So adopting this strategy would acknowledge that the intrinsic value of oysters as habitat out there is greater than what we would get from harvesting them and using them as a fishery resource. Strategy 2 is the second approach, the culch supported harvest strategy. And that's kind of what we're doing now, where we're the value of the habitat equals the value of the fishery resource. So we're really trying to balance any damage done to the habitat and having that cutoff when we're like, okay, there's no more harvesting because any more harvesting would be too damaging to the habitat, but we still recognize there's a fishery value there, and we're trying to balance that habitat and fishery value. And the third strategy outlined in the appendix is rotational culch management sites. In these sites, the strategy prioritizes the fishery value over the habitat. So we're saying we're going to make these sites, we're prioritizing them as harvest areas. There'll be, there won't be kind of restrictions that we have on some of these other strategies to kind of promote in direct harvest to these sites and have them be a source of fishery harvest. So that first approach, the deep water oyster recovery area approach. So we do know that the deep water reefs have suffered mass mortality in these low dissolved oxygen events. In particular, since the hurricanes in 2018, Florence and Matthew, we have found very few live or legal oysters out there in those deep water areas on the map. In the mouth of that one is Neuse River, that have been live or legal oysters out there since 2018. We have been seeing some recovery with spat setting out there and some growing, but it likely hasn't supported much fishery effort since 2018. Again, there's been no culch planting effort out in those areas to kind of make up for any shell that's been removed through fishery harvest. So the deep water oyster recovery area strategy proposes that mechanical harvest not be open for those deep water recovery areas. And so this one here shows the Pamlico River one, and you can see the boundaries of these deep water oyster recovery areas are formed by using on the water channel markers and navigational beacons that are already out there. So the boxes are pretty big, but that's just for enforceability. So if you look at that map, the red areas in there within the box are actually the potential oyster habitat that's been mapped. And so that what potential oyster habitat means is any oyster reef or hard bottom that had been mapped between 1887 and 2007. In the Pamlico River one, for instance, we don't have as good a data as we do for the Neuse River one. But we're talking about in the Neuse River one, only approximately 0.8% of the total area is actual potential oyster habitat. So there's a lot of soft bottom in that box and a very small amount of oyster compared to that huge footprint of the box. In this one, we have it's a little bit of a, we had to do some estimating because we don't have the full footprint of those points mapped, but doing some extrapolation, approximately 3% of that box is potentially oyster habitat, and that's probably with some very large error bars around it. And again, just to kind of reiterate, on the right is the deep water oyster reefs out in the middle of the Neuse River actually being dove on, and what it looks like out there, kind of just shell hash, very few live oysters, no vertical height, just kind of a flat patch of shells and shell hash. And on the left is a sanctuary in Neuse River showing kind of high relief oysters in areas that are not harvested. So the second approach, strategy 2, is using mulch planting to support harvest. And so from that map, you saw that there has been significant mulch planting effort in the bays across and in the eastern portion of Pamlico Sound. The proposed, this culch supported harvest area is proposed to encompass all culch planting sites we have out there. It's not a big change from what we're doing now. We propose this using the existing bushel limits, existing management areas, season dates, everything the same, except we'd like to replace the current trigger monitoring program and create fixed season lengths by area to kind of give more certainty to harvesters at the beginning of the season. And I'll go on to explain kind of how that would work. So right now we do the trigger monitoring, and any areas can kind of close within 72 hours based on sampling. This approach, we would use all of our trigger or past trigger sampling data to inform how long the future season would be. So one of the first complaints is that we're not sampling where the fishery is occurring. So step 1 in this new approach should be getting pre-season industry reports from the fishery. We create kind of a dedicated voicemail box, email, where people can report, this is where you should sample for this season. And that'll be crucial participation from the industry in this approach to kind of best direct us where to sample. Without that input, we'll be kind of sampling, based on our previous knowledge or the best of our ability where we think there'll be oysters, but it may not be representative. So without industry kind of input, we'll be kind of sampling the best we can. But from that industry input, where we go out and sample, we'll do pre-season sampling where we'll go out and determine the condition of the oyster reefs out there. So based on that pre-season condition, using all the data we have from our previous sampling, we can figure out how long the season should be. So a proclamation would come out at the very beginning of the season saying, for this management area, the season will be X weeks long. The season will open, people will have a chance to go out and fish, and then we've asked them to give us in-season industry reports of where they're fishing, where the best fishing is happening for them, and where we should go out and sample one more time. We'll do our in-season sampling, look at the condition of the resource, see if we were kind of spot on, if, okay, the first season length we in the proclamation is correct, and the condition of the reef, the resource will hit that threshold within that season, or if we've kind of underestimated and actually the resource can support X amount more weeks based on our previous data, we'll issue a new proclamation and make the season longer if needed. The third strategy in that paper are the rotational culture site strategy. And the division's culture planting program has already been building these large 10-acre culture sites with the goal of having 4 management sites constructed by each management area by 2026. Right now, we have 10 constructed. If the strategy is implemented, we'll be able to finish them all in time to implement it. Right. So the strategy for this would be a rotational opening approach. So in any given management area, one 10-acre site right now would be open each season. It would then be open for 1 season, close, be allowed to grow for 3 years, and open again on the 4th. And they would rotate around the sound. And as when they were closed, if culture needed to be replenished, it could be replanted by the division. These sites would be outside of that culture supported approach with the season lengths. It would be open the full season, November through March, and they're in the 15 bushel limit areas. So it'd be kind of wide open. When the area is open, it'll be open the full season. So with that, we'll just go over our preliminary division recommendations. So for Appendix 1, the recreational harvest, the division supports the Marine Fisheries Commission encouraging us to further explore, asking us to further explore potential options, develop a solution to quantify recreational shellfish harvest participation in landings, and to establish a mechanism to provide all recreational shellfish harvesters shellfish sanitation and safety information outside of the MLO process. And for Appendix 2, the preliminary division recommendation is to adopt the deep water oyster recovery areas. Adopt the rotational culture site strategy, and adopt adaptive management, and adopt the culture supported harvest strategy as outlined in the paper. And so we can come back to those slides during the discussion to kind of go over the pros and cons as you guys are deliberating. But that brings us to the next step here, where you will kind of deliberate and provide us some feedback and motions.
Okay, gentlemen, like y'all have any questions of our esteemed panel here who presented this? What they're looking at? This is your time to ask questions.
Tom, can I say something real fast?
Sure.
Just, so the way we have the agenda laid out, we do have a time period here for the public comment.
I thought that was after we.
It is after the discussion. Kind of what we want to do is if there's any questions about the presentation or that's specific to the presentation, go ahead and have those now.
Yes.
Then we'll kind of move on to the clam presentation. And then the actual deliberation and voting would take place after the clam and after the public comment. Yeah, I just want to make sure that everyone understood that.
Very good.
You said, after the reef, the cold planted reef area gains a certain height, how long do you anticipate from day 1 to opening day to harvest? Would that be that time span?
The deep water recovery area. So we don't have a specific, I mean, I've thrown out an inch of growth per year as a rough guess, only because that's kind of how long it takes us. About 3 years to see illegal oyster on some of our culture planting sites. So that's what I can expect, but we really don't know how long it could take. So there is some uncertainty there in how long it would take.
My point is, you're looking at the reefs in the river. Some of those reefs, they started back in the ice ages, thousands of years old.
Absolutely.
So that's the big question for me, that if you're gonna put all this effort into it, and you need to determine a time period, okay, and plan it in 2025. We expect, and we're gonna open harvest in 2030.
I don't think there's a real intention to open the deep water anytime soon. It's the idea is to recover height there to make them viable. Is that my understanding or not?
So the way the strategy is outlined in this FMP, they would be, assuming that strategy is adopted, the reefs would be closed at least through the next FMP unless the commission reopen the FMP and change the strategy. So we're talking at least 5 years for, between plans, one full plan cycle for this FMP, it would be closed if this was adopted.
And basically, you're saying you're not gonna open those areas, you're gonna close them.
Well, they're closed already,
And they're
right?
gonna be permanently closed.
They're open.
they are.
They're open. Assuming there's, so the broad management area outside of the bay is if there are sites that are being fished that are above the current threshold now, which is 26% legal, that area is open. So it's a very broad management area across kind of Pamlico River and Neuse River areas. So if this strategy was adopted, it would be those boxes within those management areas would not be open.
I thought I understood that the intent was not to ever reopen them. From the presentation, from when I read it. I mean, not saying that it couldn't be, obviously anything that's done could be changed, but it sounded like the intent was a permanent closure on those two boxes.
I think just the time scale for recovery would be at least, one plan, right? And then you'd have to reevaluate. And again, it's up to the commission, but I think the intent for this would be closed through this plan, at least for sure, and reevaluate.
So what defines recovery? Because I thought you were looking to get that height that got it above the hypoxia level, 2.5 meters, or whatever that may be. And it didn't seem like an inch a year with the height that they said they were currently at could ever get us there within 5 years.
I think it could be something where, we look at it in 5 years from now, we're like, okay, this did nothing, let's abort, or this is working, let's soldier on.
I would say if you don't add a lot of material, you're not gonna get anywhere out there. If you don't take it, and they look like they're basically in lines on a ridge to some degree, but if you don't put material on them to get them some elevation over this 5-year period, you'll be nowhere. They'll be too low, you won't get anywhere, you'll never recover. And if they don't get some attention, you're just gonna have another continued dead spot, maybe a little bit here or there, based on what the water quality is, having a.
So currently, we're not permitted to plant out there, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future, but it would take some.
Yeah, there would have to be some more permitting applications.
Even just material.
Yeah.
Without.
So culture material currently is permitted via Nationwide 27. That's through the Army Corps of Engineers. And that limits to where we can plant. And so these areas, these deep water areas, are not within that permit.
Yeah.
The sanctuaries that are built around this area, those are through CAMA. And that's another permit process.
I think you're gonna have a real problem ever get the height you need. You can't put material out.
Was the hope that oysters would set, die off through hypoxia, set again, die off, and achieve that height? I'm trying to figure out how you get to that recovery.
You never will.
From doing nothing at all. And as a follow-up, do we have any validity to that theory, if that's what you're thinking? Areas like New River that have been closed since the 60s and 70s, have those rocks raised in elevation to where they would exceed that hypoxia level, or maybe some around these bombing ranges? We've got areas that have been closed for 60, 70 years. Have we seen that kind of growth to validate this theory that, hey, if we close these areas, this is what will potentially happen? Or is this just, for lack of a better term, a science experiment to see what happens? And I don't mean any offense by that. I'm just trying to figure out if we close thousands of acres, even though it's not all shell bottom, what are we hoping to get out of it, and how do we validate that theory that we're going to give us something to hang our hat on and say, yep, that's a great idea. So anything you can do, and that may be better for discussion later, but I just have a lot of questions about whether we're going to achieve this. Has it ever been done in the past? It just seems kind of far-fetched to me, but
You had to get around the water quality issue.
yeah, hypoxia kills. And if you're not gonna dump shell, and I don't even know if you can plant on existing shell beds, but if you're not gonna do that, it just doesn't seem like we're ever gonna get a reef to double, triple in size. I mean, hundreds of years, maybe, I don't know.
Unless you get out of that hypoxia or something.
I think the rationale a little bit behind it, where we know it's a long-term game for sure, and to see if it would work, that we do know that mechanical harvest tends to really break up any of the, I mean, having a kind of solidified reef structure goes against kind of what you're looking for when you're mechanically harvesting. So you're dragging a dredge over it and breaking it up. So the thought process is, if we stop breaking them up, maybe it'll allow them to kind of solidify and at least become a little more stable and not be that shell hash for when maybe they do die and it's a hypoxic event. There's at least a kind of cemented little bit of restructure there for more things to kind of grow on, to at least give it a jump start to maybe start growing. But yeah,
Maybe what you're talking about dragging, and I guess in the clam FMP, you talk about eliminating mechanical harvest, or you talking about hydraulic these are all forms of mechanical harvest. Because you do that for clam, it's gonna transport stuff right back to oyster.
so for this box, we'll be talking about mechanical oyster harvest, which is kind of defined about what can be used and how, and it's basically just dredges. In the clam plan, it's a different beast, and that's specific just to mechanical clam harvest.
This is not
We'll
an
get to
area
that.
where you could harvest clams currently.
But as a follow-up, have we seen anything like this in New River where it's been closed for, it was either the 60s or 70s, so that area was permanently closed to
Turned
oyster
into a special
dredging, and
secondary.
it's got 18, 20 plus feet of water where shell bottom exists. It occasionally has hypoxic events and algal bloom. In that 60, 70 years, have those reefs, you know, I'm just, just looking for something to validate this thing.
Have they improved?
Have they got up to an elevation that you would consider recovery for the ones that we're looking at?
Are we talking kind of above the bridge there in New River?
Anywhere. I mean, the whole river is closed to oyster dredging, to my knowledge, and has been for 60, 70, 80 years, somewhere in that range, a very long period of time. Have those reefs done what you're hoping this will do? Because it'd be nice to say that, yeah, we've seen this before. I mean,
I guess one issue with New River above the bridge is a little bit different than Pamlico Sound, because it, I guess, currently isn't the best place to grow oysters and has been spat limited. So we've put material out there.
It grows pretty good, but I mean, the garden's all the way around it.
Yeah. So it hasn't been a great place for wild oysters to grow because
That's a whole different ballgame. We've been overrun with garden.
Yeah.
because we have done some culture planting out there that we just don't see spat setting on. So there's been some work to kind of create the oyster highway.
Those are all shallow water gardens. What you're talking about is deep water.
And so I'm not sure there's
for
a
this
historic.
area in Pamlico Sound. It's not the best area for growing oysters right now.
I just don't know if there is the historic reefs there in that deeper portion of the New River, like there were in Pamlico Sound. I'm not sure.
You should go right there to Hospital Point.
There are hard shell bottom. My dad worked those as a kid, and so did my granddad in deep water in New River. And that's kind of where my mind went. And I also noticed on your maps, we have the bombing ranges, the military danger areas. And in the outskirts of both of those, in that 15 foot of water or so, there are yellow spots there where we've mapped this habitat. And I'm not aware that those have done what we're hoping to do. And those have been closed since, I believe, the 40s. So I'm just questioning whether this strategy makes sense, whether we've seen anything like this before. I know like off of, before you get turning in bay, y'all got that high relief reef, and yeah, the oysters on top are good, the ones on bottom don't. Why aren't we doing that in the deep water for creating habitat? Because that's immediately got them above that hypoxic level, at least some of them, instead of hanging our hat on closing huge areas and hoping that it goes to 13 feet. I mean,
I don't see if you don't put material, you're never gonna get there.
I'm all for habitat, I'm all for whatever it does to improve the oyster fishery. I look back, and this is kind of getting in discussion, probably I'll not go this far away, but I look back in the original FMP, and in 1880, before dredging ever started, they said these reefs were in poor condition and fishery was really a little of nothing. And sure, we had 1.8 million pounds when all the dredgers come from up north and started, but that's the most land we've ever had. In the Chesapeake, they were catching 10 to 12 times that. I don't know that we've ever had the fishery here that justifies closing all this and hoping that something big is gonna happen, and that's one of my primary questions. I just don't know how we think something major is gonna come of this when there doesn't seem to have ever been a major fishery like we've seen in some other bodies of water like Chesapeake. I'll stop talking that, that went beyond the question, but it's just, I'm curious as to whether we've seen it before or whether it's a valid theory.
Time frame.
So I've got a question.
When is you're putting into it, but when does the output come?
So I've got a question that's somewhat related. So, back in many years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, there were two sites that were closed off to experiment with boulders, putting boulders in the water, to bring, these oysters higher up in the water column in hopes that it would create one of these deep water reef situations. And it did not do that. There was just a very little growth, and only at the top of the structure. And so my question is, what are the status of those two experiments now?
Where are these located?
Pamlico Sound. The division
Is
put them
that-
there.
Are you talking about the sanctuaries?
They made sanctuaries around them where there was nothing there before.
Okay. So with sanctuaries, I'm sorry, what exactly are you?
I'm asking you because when I asked about this situation with the article, because a pretty good portion of the sound was closed to fishing, to justify this closure and throw these boulders overboard, has what they thought would happen occurred.
So
There was virtually nothing latching on to these boulders. Very little.
So at the sanctuaries, we see very high densities of oysters, and those have been persisting since they were constructed. The first ones were built in 1996, and still they hold host oyster densities in the hundreds to thousands per square meter.
So are they on the top? Are they?
They're all
over?
around. I dive on each of them each year, and
So you consider that to be a successful venture?
yeah. So the caveat being, Joe alluded to it before, that we have a deep water sanctuary called Little Creek. So that goes down to about 22 feet. And so that's right, it's west of the bombing range in Neuse River. And above 18 feet, we see those oysters. Below that, not so much.
So yeah, I guess kind of the criteria we're looking for recovery doesn't necessarily get 14 feet off the bottom. We just need to be shallower than 18 feet. So if they're, at a 19 foot, we need, 1 foot of oyster growth. So it's not, we don't need to grab 14 feet of vertical height. We just need to get above that 18-foot depth.
So how much for those areas that you marked off? I think you said somewhere 0.5 meter, How much growth is it gonna take in those areas, because it didn't show depth of water or anything, to get those above?
So we don't have that right this second, but we could probably do some better, maybe a little finer scale with depth on these maps and look at that.
I just think, again, probably not proper time discussion, but I would be more comfortable if it was outlined what recovery was and what it took to get there. And there was some kind of timeline where you called it quits and said, hey, recovery isn't gonna occur, and we're gonna harvest oysters when they're there, and we're just gonna have to not harvest them when they're not. It seems like it should be more well thought out as far as this area needs this much growth to be recovered, and we don't have a stock assessment. We don't have really anything to go on except for we're hoping these will recover, and I really don't have recovery defined anywhere like we traditionally do in FMP when we're trying to accomplish something. One more question I have got, and I don't know that you can provide an answer. I constantly read and hear at the General Assembly and everywhere that 95% of our oysters in the state, traditional levels, are gone. If we can say that we're at 5%, how is it we can't produce an assessment or stock status? Or are people just saying that with no way to back it up? Because I've read it in the Coastal Review, I've read it in stuff from Sea Grant, I've heard it on the floor at the General Assembly, and it's kind of persistent. We're at 5% of our traditional levels on oysters, but we can't get a stock status or a stock assessment done. So I don't know where that came from.
I think that's based on kind of just oyster footprint. So as a habitat, where they're compared to the historic documentation we have of kind of the extent of where oysters were, we're now reduced to 5%. And I'm not sure if that number is right or where it's from, but that's what it's implying, that the footprint of oysters. So that's kind of how we've been managing oysters basically until right now, is they are a fishery resource, but we're really kind of managing them habitat wise. So we're kind of mapping them as a habitat area wise. We're closing the fishery down when they reach a habitat protection threshold of that 26%. So it's really not, there's not kind of a mortality threshold we're worrying about. There's no like fishing mortality target we're aiming for. It's just 26% legal as a habitat protection threshold. So the habitat becomes too degraded from the fishery effort when the percent legal of oysters becomes below 26%. And that's been working. At least there's still culture there and mature oysters there to spawn and kind of repopulate. So it's working to kind of protect them from that mortality, but it's really how we've been managing has been kind of a habitat approach.
So habitat for oysters or habitat for everything in general?
Oysters as their own habitat, essentially. I guess the question I have, I don't know if it's time for it, but how would you feel with a smaller deep water oyster recovery area? So if we made the box not as large, like with the goal of, having an area that's maybe more experimental, so we could actually have, the box now cut it in half, and one half becomes our control where fishing's allowed, and the other box is where we're looking at kind of to assess whether or not what we're doing is working.
I think you need to experiment, but I think you need to experiment in another area and stuff, rather than just a shell debris culture material. I think you need to look into the larger, what do you call them, the big balls, might be 6 foot tall, and placing those in certain spots, bowls, and placing those in certain spots, and let's see what they produce.
I don't know right now, kind of enhancing like planting material on those natural reefs is off the table, but I don't know if that couldn't be something we pursue in the future if we have, these boxes as a way to enhance. That's kind of the habitat enhancement side.
Well, that would get you above that high fish count.
Instantly, yeah.
Oxygen level that you need
oyster industry.
It's gonna take you, it's gonna take you a while to grow them on them boulders.
You're not gonna drag a
That's all I
can't drag a
got to
bench
say.
through that, can you?
You would just try to see if they live, that's all that's gonna do.
Yeah.
I mean, so we know they do live because we do
They
that
are, but
currently with the
they're
sanctuary
talking about
program, right?
balls.
So we're
And these boulder things that they
Right.
put
Yeah, so
over
recovering
in
a natural
nineteen
reef.
ninety-six, it took forever.
I didn't think the oysters adhered to those as well as natural culture. That's the reason why they went into natural culture.
Well, I can tell you something,
Natural shell.
they will adhere to you.
They used
Throw
to
you some crab pots off there and stack you some crab pots. That's gonna find you an oyster reef in just a few years.
That is true.
I think there is some merit to doing a narrow and a control and I guess, whatever type reason, may be something. But I'm still not convinced unless you do something to help raise things up that you'll ever get there. If you can't put some material down as a test, even if you can find some way to do that, do one, leave it as it is. One, you put stuff down, if you gain some height, does it really work for you?
50-acre tract.
I mean, you got a spine coming down there. I mean, there's one major spine. You can just do an area, split it in half and see what happens.
I mean, that would be more scientific, obviously, than just closing an entire area, because you would have something beside it that was open, because you kind of took in that whole area of shell bottom, but I can't tell you exactly how I feel about it.
But you could rest assured the area that was left open was the reason that the other area didn't grow.
Well,
I just,
right now, you got to do something that gives you some real data that it works or doesn't work, and just closing the whole area off, I'm not sure that's going to give you, there's no control.
There's a few sites outside, but yeah, the majority, at least in the mouths of the river there, were captured with the deep water oyster recovery box. So there are some sites outside of the box, but the majority is definitely inside.
is it possible to do like you do on your Gulf site, where you just really all small areas out here in this deep water? I mean, from what I've seen, nobody goes into Gulf sites when they're closed. They wait till you open it. I don't know if you've seen different. Obviously, y'all check them more than I do, but if you could just buoy off an area, which would make it really hard to get there and full of dredge to start with, and take 2 or 3 piles out there instead of just this box, and say, hey, let's just not dredge these for a few years, just these small shell piles, and see what happens to them. And of course, the other ones may be open, may not, depending on whether they meet your criteria. But something like that seems more scientific to me than just taking this shot in the dark. I'd rather we dip our toe in than a leap of faith and just close it all and see what happens, because it doesn't seem like we get areas reopened when they're closed, no matter what our intentions are. It just seems to stay permanently closed. And I think that's what a lot of the guys are going to be scared of, is if it closes, whether it works or not, it will never open again. And that's my opinion.
Anybody else? Okay. Let's move to the clam.
One second to get this shared on WebEx.
All right, so my name's Lorena. I'm one of the clam co-leads, and with me today is also Jeff Dobbs, one of the other co-leads. I'll talk briefly on some key points from the hard clam base plan, and then we'll be focusing on the mechanical harvest issue paper and preliminary DMF management recommendations. So for your reference, again, this is where we are in the FMP development timeline, same as oyster. And we are here today for advisory committee to review and receive public comment on draft amendment 3. I'll be going over the goal and objectives for hard clam, a characterization of the fishery, an overview of Appendix 1, which is the mechanical clam harvest issue paper, preliminary division recommendations, and then open it up to discussion. So the goal and objectives for Amendment 3 were approved at the November 2023 MFC meeting. The goal of the North Carolina Hard Clam FMP is to manage the hard clam resource to provide long-term harvest and continue to offer protection and ecological benefits to North Carolina's estuaries. Currently, the available hard clam data comes from commercial landings, fish house sampling, and a recreational survey of cruffle holders. The recreational survey does not provide data for the entire recreational clam fishing population, as you do not need a recreational license to harvest clams in North Carolina. So without complete recreational data, we cannot accurately estimate total removals. This issue is discussed earlier during the oyster presentation and is a shared issue between both plans. So this graph shows North Carolina commercial hard clam landings and trips from public bottom from 1994 to 2022. Landings and participation have been in steady decline across the entire time period, mainly due to market demand. Our focus today is Appendix 1, the mechanical clam harvest issue paper. So the number of participants and trips in the mechanical clam fishery on public bottom have steadily declined since the 1990s to the lowest levels on record. This, along with habitat concerns associated with bottom disturbing gears, as well as resources needed for the state to manage and monitor the fishery, has caused the division to re-examine the mechanical clam fishery. This is a graph showing mechanical clam landings from 1994 to 2022, shown by the gray bars, and this also includes the number of participants in the fishery, depicted by the black line. Harvest during this time peaked in 1995 at over 8.7 million clams, then declines to less than 100,000 clams since 2017. Participation mirrors a similar decline with 138 participants in 1996, then declining to less than 10 each year since 2017. This figure shows which water bodies account for the majority of the landings from 1994 to 2022 using mechanical gear. Mechanical clam harvest landings have been dominated by two water bodies, the New River, shown in yellow, and Core Sound, shown in gray. Enforcement and maintenance of designated mechanical clam harvest boundaries require substantial resources from the state. Each year, division staff marks all the mechanical clam harvest area boundaries with posts and signs to ensure enforceability of these boundaries. Staff replace all missing or damaged posts and signs that are affected by weather or vandalism. Additionally, Marine Patrol officers are required to monitor and enforce these areas. In Core Sound, the vast area open to mechanical clam harvest, along with its zigzagging boundaries, makes enforcement difficult and resource intensive. The last piece of background that I'll go over is the allowance of mechanical harvest permitted prior to maintenance dredging. Through rule, the division allows the mechanical harvest of clams before maintenance dredging occurs in some of our navigational channels. The purpose of this rule is to allow commercial fishermen to access a resource that would otherwise be destroyed during the maintenance dredging process. This process requires collaboration between fishermen, the division, and Army Corps of Engineers. This rule has not been utilized since 2007, primarily because of the complicated process and limited interest. One of the primary concerns with mechanical clam harvest is the damage this harvest method can cause to habitat. Bottom disturbing gear, which includes dredges and trawls, cause physical damage to clams and their habitat. Soft bottom habitats have historically been considered the most appropriate location to use bottom disturbing gear. However, organisms living in this habitat and adjacent habitats can be harmed by these gears. The mechanical gear used to harvest clams are escalator dredges and clam trawls. Current fishery regulations prohibit the use of mechanical gear on SAV beds and live oyster beds, and is only allowed in designated harvest areas because of the destructive capacity of the gear. Another habitat concern is sedimentation, as mechanical gear can create significant turbidity issues. Bottom disturbing gear can have negative impacts on clam beds and oyster reefs directly and indirectly. Direct effects include physical damage caused by the gear, and indirect effects include the resuspension of sediment. High levels of suspended sediment can reduce successful settlement of larval clams and oysters and can smother shellfish by clogging their gills. These two maps depict two mechanical clam harvest areas, North River on the left and Bogue Sound on the right. From 1981 to 2021, a series of studies were conducted to map SAV beds across the state. The SAV maps generated from these studies were then overlaid onto the mechanical clam harvest area maps to look for areas of SAV overlap. The mechanical clam harvest areas were then adjusted to eliminate overlap and provide a buffer. An example of this overlap and area modification can be seen on the figure on the left of North River, where the red dotted line shows the new southern boundary line. On the right is the Bogue Sound clam mechanical harvest area, and due to large extent of overlap, this mechanical clam harvest area has been closed. These changes occurred after Amendment 2 in 2017. So,
Whitehead River.
sorry?
About Whitehead River.
Whitehead River.
What about it?
Is it still in?
On alternating years. Oh,
Just wondering why you didn't include it there.
she was just providing
Just
examples.
examples. So now shifting into the socioeconomic analysis for this issue paper. Here showing annual economic contributions from the mechanical clam commercial fishery for the last 11 years. From 2012 to 2022, ex-vessel values have varied from a high of approximately 285,000 in 2012 to a low of approximately 19,000 in 2020. The industry expanded in 2021, but has not returned to pre-2016 landings or participation, which has steadily declined over the period. Each year, the division uses a large number of staff and resources to monitor, manage, and enforce the fishery. These resources may be difficult to justify for a fishery with such diminished value. State resources may be better used to fund projects more beneficial to the clam fishery as a whole. In the background, we discussed mechanical clam harvest prior to maintenance dredging. So if the mechanical clam harvest fishery on public bottom were to be discontinued, it is necessary to end the exemption for mechanical harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging, as is currently allowed by rule. This would further benefit the habitat by reducing the extent of turbidity issues associated with mechanical weirs. Again, this program has not been utilized since 2007. I will now move into the possible management options. Status quo would allow the fishery to continue to operate as it currently does. This would allow for the continuation of a historically significant fishery that provides important supplemental income to some users. The fishermen currently operating the fishery could continue and new harvesters could join. State resources for demarcation and enforcement would remain the same. Concerns about effects of bottom disturbing gears on structured habitats would not be addressed. Another option is to further limit mechanical clam harvest areas to improve enforceability and lessen habitat effects. This could be done by having boundary lines based on permanent structures and more rectangular in shape to also help with line of sight visibility. This was done in the North River, displayed here. Modified boundaries could also create buffers around critical habitat to protect them from sedimentation associated with bottom disturbing gears. As with status quo, the fishermen currently operating in the fishery could continue and new harvesters could join. State resources for demarcation would be reduced, but the resources required for enforcement would likely remain the same. This would help address habitat concerns, but sedimentation would still occur from mechanical harvesting operations. The next management option would be a phase out of the mechanical clam fishery. Due to the requirements of the general statute listed here, the mechanical clam harvest fishery cannot be ended abruptly upon adoption of this amendment. Outlined in the statute, an immediate closure of the fishery could result in severe curtailment of the usefulness or value of equipment in which fishermen have any substantial investment. Additionally, stated in the statute, this would require a future effective date so as to minimize undue potential economic loss to fishermen. The mechanical clam harvest fishery could be phased out over a set time frame, as was done with the shellfish relay program. This option would allow fishermen currently operating the fishery to continue during the phase-out period, but would discourage new participants. The phase-out period would allow current mechanical harvesters time to get rid of their gear and transition to other clam harvesting methods or fisheries. This option would address the division's resources concerns with demarcation and enforcement, as well as the habitat concerns. Regardless of the phase out, mechanical gear can still be used in the private sector. After hearing concerns from the FMP Advisory Committee about participants wanting the ability to re-enter the fishery, the division recommends a phase out timeframe of 3 years from adoption of this amendment, unless landings increase to at least 1 million clams and participation increases to at least 10 participants in the fishery in any year prior to 2027. 10 participants have not been active in a single year in the fishery since 2017. In 2022, there were 3 participants. The fishery last landed over 1 million clams in 2014, and in 2022, less than 200,000 clams were landed. This increase in landings and participation would show that the fishery is no longer diminishing and is valuable enough to maintain. This is a timeline if both triggers are met in any single year prior to 2027. This timeline would comply with the general statute. If the triggers are met, the issue would be brought back to the MFC for consideration at the May 2027 business meeting, or when participation and harvest estimates from 2026 are available. If the triggers are not reached, the phase out would be complete in May 2028. The phase out period gives fishermen 3 years to sell their gear and transition to other clam harvesting methods or fisheries. The last management option to be considered is discontinuing the allowance for mechanical clam harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging. This would end a program that has not been utilized since 2007. This would require a rule suspension, and this option could be pursued on its own or in conjunction with the phase out of the whole fishery mentioned previously. The division recommends a phase out to be completed 3 years from the adoption of this plan, unless fishery participation and landing triggers discussed previously are met, and to discontinue the allowance for mechanical clam harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging. These management options would only affect mechanical clam harvest from public bottom. It would not affect their use on private bottom. Mechanical clam harvesting gear can still be used in the private sector. And that's all.
Okay. Questions?
First, can we go back to the slide that showed participants' recent years, ex vessel value?
Yes.
I've got a question about that. Ex vessel value 2022 75,000.
Less than.
Yeah, less than. I mean, it says income impact, so I'm assuming the less than was $44,000 was made, or. And I'm wondering why it has to be less than when we have 44,520. The ex vessel value.
I'll say this, if you look at the bottom left, it's such a limited number, it's confidential. They don't want to share.
Less than 3 dealers reported, so we can't share the ex vessel value, but the calculated values,
It's the same as ex vessel.
no, it's not the same. If you look at the income impact, that would be inappropriate if it was, but it is not. It's
And the reason I'm asking, I know this isn't extremely valuable fishery right now to the state, but the 3 participants, 44, 50, 60, whatever it happens to be, I don't know what the number is, could be a really significant portion of the income for a few weeks in the wintertime. I mean, you know, it's not insignificant to those three. And I was just, I don't know, I've got some questions about that. I'll bring up it when we actually get into discussion, but I just wanted some clarification on that part. I wanted to point out that, you know, for three participants, that could be a significant amount of income, depending on what that number actually is.
It's probably the three people that can actually afford to keep the dredge running.
Yeah, so, and, a follow-up question, I want to know why we're considering the value of the fishery and recommending that we phase it out. It's a very small fishery. I didn't see nothing in the goals and objectives of the plan or in statute that says, hey, when you get a very small fishery and in somebody's mind, the value of the fishery doesn't justify your job as managers or the law enforcement officer's job as enforcing, that you just phase it out. I actually went around when I worked at the division every year and put those posts in, pumped them down, checked, see which ones were broken off, tap them, see if they're rotten. I never questioned whether anybody was going to be in there kicking that year. It was just my job. So I'm just wondering how we come to the conclusion and what in statute or anything else leads us to believe that just because there's not a huge value in this fishery and it's only a few participants, we just get rid of it, because in the future, market may change or something may change that this fishery would once be valuable again. So, I know I've kind of went off on a tangent there, but what gets us to the point that we get rid of it because it's not value? I feel like that's a dangerous precedent to set. It could be an economic, a market issue that people aren't doing it right now or something.
So that's a pretty broad question, and if you want the complete explanation of our justification, I would point you to the discussion portion of the paper. But generally speaking, if you look at the goals and objectives, we go back to the goals and objectives page. I'll start with that portion. You asked about how it relates to the objectives, and then also the justification, and you also asked if we had thought about the current users. So if you look at objective 2 of the goals and objectives, it says manage hard clam harvesting gear to use to minimize damage to the habitat. The clams are still available. We would just be minimizing this habitat damaging gear.
But judging by that slide you showed earlier, with that black line went down to the very bottom, we have already.
Okay, hold on, one at a time.
One at a time,
Clarifying questions, we can get into discussion later, but I'd be happy to answer the questions.
It just seems like three participants, we have already minimized those impacts to drastically from what they were. Matter of fact, we're saying if we don't increase participation in the fishery, it's not valuable enough. So it seems like we're trying to increase the impacts or we're gonna get rid of the fishery. So
what's the
it
question?
seems like a moot point.
I was just going to say that, I mean, I've engaged in the mechanical harvest of clams myself. And generally that is, when we did it, it was in deeper water and you could not, you had to mechanically harvest the clams because the water is too deep to hand harvest clams. That's why people do it, because they can't do it. They can't harvest these clams. And oddly, nowadays, chowder clams are worth just as much or more as licks. And you aren't going to get chowder clams in the shallow water. They're all gone. I mean, you'll find the conchs every now and then, but the bigger clams are in the deeper water. Thus, you need mechanical harvest to get to these clams.
But if the industry is not resource limited, couldn't they just change their effort to hand harvest for something that's worth the same per clam as what you said?
What about exploring other options? I mean, it looked like to me, you're just saying all mechanical harvest. There are other gears that are available that could be used. If you explore those, and they're a lot more economical to operate. If you could pull those in, then you might get some fishermen to say, hey, look, I'm gonna invest in this because it's cheaper than that dredge, and I'm gonna use this gear, Pat and Tom, power rake.
Well, if they, my thought would be, if that was happening, they should be doing it already,
Yeah,
but they're not.
yeah.
Well, and when you're keeping
Well, you
clams,
can't because it's outlaw.
but when you're keeping clams, there's no SAB. So,
Those areas are already included, but I guess my question was, why we're looking at minimal value as a reason to phase out when value could be increased in the future because of market conditions or more people coming into a fishery or anything else. It just seems like the wrong reason to phase a fishery out because it's small. I mean, normally you're trying to manage a large fishery and reduce effort, reduce impacts. Now we got a very small fishery. Hey, if we don't increase effort and increase the impact, we're gonna do away with it. And it just seems contrary to everything we do.
What percentage of the overall clamming is this in the way of catch?
Can you go to our, well, first, I feel like we're not getting a chance to answer his question. So could I answer your question after I address the justification question? So it's not a single reason, it's a suite of reasons. So the fishery has minimal value. It is a high resource cost to the division to enforce and to maintain and to manage this fishery. And there's also habitat concerns. Not so much with SAB, correct, with direct damage, but there's sedimentation concerns and there's turbidity concerns. So we've been tasked by the commission through the CHIP to reduce bottom disturbing gear or habitat damaging gear where possible. We are taking this opportunity. It's low hanging fruit. It's a very minimally valuable fishery, and it could result in impacts, positive impacts to the habitat. So this seems like the most appropriate approach for this particular.
except for those people, you're just,
Okay,
there's three people.
what percentage is this?
Can you go to the pocket slide? Keep going, one more. So right here, we have landings for hand and mechanical, and that's the percentage on the right. And you can see it was up around the mid-20s for the total landings, and now we're down into the mid single digits. Yeah. And just to note that the entire fishery has declined drastically. So it's not that 7% is not the same as saying, you know, we've dropped a certain amount in that time period. It's off of the entire harvest. So it's much more drastic than that would look.
But with the exception of the last 10 years, it made up a lot of years, a quarter of the total overall harvest. And like I say, there's so many factors that affect why somebody's engaged in a fishery. Shrimp are out there and you're pulling a shrimp trawl with the same boat you would pull your clam dredge with or whatever. So it's real hard to just look at the past 10 years and say this is minimal and assume that it won't be important to somebody in the future when it was 25% of the fishery.
And to address that, we heard that at the AC workshop, the advisory committee FMP workshop. And we heard that, and we heard that folks might want to get back into the fishery. We actually had a family there, one of our AC members, her family was involved in this fishery. And that's why we went from having a phase out to a triggered phase out, so that if people did get back into the fishery in that time period, the commission could re-examine it.
And I do appreciate that thought into it, but 3 years of very high shrimp catch.
The other side of that is that this fishery is a very high cost to entry, as Ken had alluded to earlier. The only people still doing it are the people that can afford to maintain the gear. New gear, extremely expensive. An escalator dredge is almost, it would be impossible to justify in current market conditions. So we're talking about people that already have the gear, getting back into the gear. They would have to fix up something that hasn't been used in years. So the idea that new participants would purchase the gear at such a high entry, that's a huge investment for something that the market doesn't really support now. That would be a poor investment by most people's standards, and that's why people aren't getting into it.
The
That's
escalator
why,
bridge,
that's why I said put forth other gear instead of leaving it
the
there.
clam net and kicker plate are totally different than an escalator bridge.
That's
and
what
they
I
are
was
not
gonna say.
So in certain
extremely
areas,
Totally
yes,
different.
but there's probably a reason why people aren't just taking their shrimp gear now, adding a kicking plate, changing the net, and dragging in core sound.
No,
I could find a clam bridge, if I get on the
You're
phone,
right.
I can have one in an hour. It's sitting in a barn, the net, I mean, that's how easy that gear and the kicker plate would be to find. Everybody still has it, it's not, you know, so the core sound, I can literally get on the phone right now and call, and I guarantee you I can find one if I had the better one to put it on, and it would not be super expensive to enter into. But it's an option, is what it is for people to get into when nothing else is going on. And it seems like such a small fishery now with 3 participants that it can't be having a major impact on anything.
I doubt anybody's gonna get into this escalator dredge.
No.
That William Herbert Steyer was the only one I ever heard of on Cedar Island. And he would take it to wherever they were doing these dredge projects. He was the only one I ever heard about, ever using one of those, and that would have been right about the time he quit. So, but there are tons of other people that use the normal way. Escalators are not the norm.
Yeah, well,
That is
just
just a chain net on a frame with a bottom rubbing thing there. That's all it is, and a kicker plate, and that's all it is. And sometimes you know, if you're in deep water, you pump your boat down, that's a whole nother thing. But, I mean, I've done that, but it's not that expensive, it really isn't. It's doors, it's this chain net and a kicker plate. That's all.
I guess my question is, I mean, what led to the big drop off in, is it the cost of doing business, or was it just wasn't,
So what they,
plants weren't there? Or?
yeah, so it's mainly market driven. Oysters are more valuable. People are getting into private culture. We had some clam kills in the New River, which was the dominant water body for harvest. But you also have to think about, we showed that X vessel value, but there's also a cost to doing business. It costs money to repair this gear, to rig it out, to pay for gas. If you're pulling something that big, one person is probably not enough, so that's 2 crew you're looking at on a boat. It's just not economical compared to other opportunities in the fishery, and that's why people have moved out of it.
But that could certainly change in the future as it has.
Change quick.
Yeah, I was a fan for the first half of my life. Clams and oysters were a primary part of my income, and when the clams started coming off of the leases in Florida after they did the net ban, the price dropped. A lot of us moved into other fisheries, and if something changed market-wise, I'd be more than happy to enter back into the fishery. I just would love to have an option down the road.
I guess
in every
Getting
fishery
back
in
to
this
20
state.
the flip side to that for me though is this is a,
That's why people want to do it, because you catch those bigger clams and they're worth more.
yeah, the flip side from my perspective of this is very few people are in this fishery right now. It is a very damaging fishery. We don't want people to expand this fishery.
How much
As a
damage,
recreational fisherman, I don't want people to expand this.
how much damage can one person or 3 people?
But if you expand it to 10 or 20 or 30 and you go back, then
In a
that's a lot more
big
damage.
area,
So
it's staked off with signs that says don't go outside these boundaries or you're gonna lose.
I
your boat.
understand. I'm just looking at the other side of the other goal, which is the habitat protection, which is a big piece of this and the big reason for that. I'm just presenting that as that's the other thing, and the fishery is not there right now. Doesn't seem economically viable, so why not?
A big part of what the division's looking at is water quality and turbidity. And this is one area of a number that cause.
Well, I hope they can get.
There's a
the wind
number of
with
things.
it.
I'm not saying this is the sole one. This is
That's all I
one
got.
of many. They're looking, I hate to say it, they're looking at low hanging fruit
Yeah,
to,
exactly.
to find something, and I understand.
And they mentioned the low hanging fruit too, and I get that, and as Pam said, I set up the other night and pulling 4550 at my house. And it takes 3 days for the water to clear up after that, and then it blows 30 again. It takes hours, literally, for that sediment to settle in a tide moving area from a dredge or a shrimp trawl, and it just seems, everything they say, every document I've read says can, could, it doesn't say does and is, and.
If I could respond to that, we can't control nature. Obviously, what we can control is the gears.
Yeah.
This is the tool in our toolbox.
Yeah.
We can't say no more recreational boaters over SAB, but it's the same questions and issues we have all the time. We can't stop the Department of Defense from doing whatever they're doing around Lejeune. We can't stop the agriculture in North Carolina, but we can control the gear that are used in fisheries.
I get it, and I
What they're
understand
doing,
that.
ain't nothing to even worry about.
And I thought about that when I was looking at that aerial picture of y'all putting the gulch out and that big plume of turbidity. And I just think about all the things that we do that cause turbidity, and if we're gonna get nitpicky over these three guys, I don't want you planting culch because it does it. I don't want somebody running the ferry. As I said before, they shrimp in Core Sound in the ferry channel on calm days. It's the only place of dirty water to catch shrimp in. So they go, when it's dead calm and the water's clear, they intentionally go to that turbid water that's caused by that ferry running back and forth, and they pull that channel. And when the wind's blowing, they go somewhere else. So everything we do stirs something up. I go to the waterway at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's crystal clear. 30 minutes later, after those boats start going through there, you couldn't see in 2 inches, and it just,
So
not to get on a tangent, but I do understand that what you're doing, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying there are just so many factors.
I do want to respond to well, culture planning is creating turbidity. Well, the net habitat gain from that is positive. The turbidity from this, the net habitat is a loss. So it's balancing those things. You're right. There is turbidity created by that, but in the same token, we're creating habitat. We're trying to enhance the habitat. That's the idea of the entire program.
So when that twin screw tug comes down the waterway and stirs mud up and it slides back and forth up and down the canal for 3 or 4 days, what advantage is that? What help is that benefit?
That's not in my wheelhouse.
I'm just asking that turbidity's in your wheelhouse.
So I say we stay on point with what we're discussing here. We're getting way off and we're a half hour behind.
I have a question about the general statute that requires the 3 year. Does it require the 3 year or does it require longer, shorter? What does it
No,
require?
it just,
Reasonable.
Doesn't require
we can,
anything.
the statute just says that you need to allow time for it. It doesn't say how long.
It doesn't say how long, so the 3 years is.
Yes. And if,
And Sam, we can, kind of later on, when we start actually talking about the options and kind of deliberating on some of the different options, if something that the advisory committee, and I'm not saying y'all do, but if you did support a phase out and you wanted to recommend a phase out of 5 years or 6 years or 4 years or the 3 that we recommended, that's well within the purview of the advisory committee. So if you did want to extend that phase out, you absolutely could.
Provided the number of participants didn't increase.
Yeah, it could be any option.
And
He
you
could
could,
say we have the opportunity to make a recommendation and whatever it may be.
Also have had a question about that, specifically about that as well, which is, when it says the Marine Fishery Commission will go back and review it, does that mean they, even if it goes above that, do they have to keep the fishery open or can they still close it?
so if it was adopted as written and recommended, it would just provide them the opportunity to re-examine the phase out period. It does not have any requirement for continuing to open it or what, it just allows them, it would trigger them to re-examine it in 2027 after the 2026 data was available.
If I may, I got one final question.
Okay.
Hopefully it'll be a short one. This year, if they do the phase out, you mentioned it would give people time to sell their gear. Who would they sell it to? You phase out a fishery, I mean, how does that not? I mean, it seems like it's no longer valuable to anybody. Who would buy it We no longer have a fishery.
If you can't drive gas mobile fields on the highway any longer, what good are they?
Yeah, so, to respond to that, the escalator dredges, that's still a gear that's used in other areas of the country, but also it's a gear that would be,
Lease land,
what's that?
they could use it on private leases.
And they could use it on private leases. And I know the next question that's coming is, why is that okay? There's buffer zones and it's not directly over active shellfish bottom. Right, when you ask to start a lease, they check the bottom if there's not shellfish, so you're not, there's less effect, but I agree that it's probably something we should re-examine, but that's not under the purview of this plan, this is public harvest only.
One of the things I looked at when we were talking about the SAB stuff was the leases and how close they are in proximity to SAB, many of them, and how we can get leases more or less right on SAB, so it just, I don't, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I think enough of this. We're gonna go to public comment, but the chair has to go to the restroom for a second.
One more question. There I go.
Be pertinent, that's all I ask.
So being pertinent, what's pertinent? Relevant to the subject?
Yeah, because I'm squirming, so hurry up.
Not at all.
I have a big cup over here.
If you say close mechanical harvesting, are you going to eliminate the ability to use patent tongs, stick rakes, or kick it?
Mechanical methods. So,
Everything's
All
gone.
mechanical.
or claims.
So you're not
It's
looking,
all,
the point being, if you're gonna eliminate all those gears under the heading of mechanical, then how's anybody gonna get back into it or want to get back into it to achieve the 10 first participation? It just, you
So
shoot
the
yourself in the foot.
We're all
Giving it-
discussed.
That's
This
where
one's going
the
down here.
trigger period would come into play. We're allowing people to rejoin the fishery during that period prior to 2027.
If they know that you're gonna eliminate it, what do they want to get into it for?
So if they met the triggers, it would be re-examined and it wouldn't necessarily be eliminated, so if they have the gear currently and they really want to keep this open, they would go into it.
no bull rates, no nothing like that.
Full rates aren't mechanical.
They're not mechanical. You drag them yourself.
Stick
So,
rake
so
in.
what is defined by that? I didn't even count that excavator thing. Besides kicking clams, what else is there?
Escalator dredge is the
As
other
far as
current
mechanical.
gear being used, but I mean, there's other gears that aren't permitted that were used in the past, as Ken was alluding to.
I'm saying besides the excavator,
Why
I'm talking
can't
about
we
just
open
kicking
those back
clams.
up?
Right now, it would be kicking clams and excavator.
And that's it.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
that's what
it.
I thought. Not anything else. I was gonna say that excavator pay, that's. If I give that anyway, it wouldn't burst. Got plenty of people kick clams. Just saying.
A lot of people use stick rake, people. They used to be flying those way. Taking plans to light it.
They talking about raking clams?
Yeah, power raking.
They just do that.
Power rake.
Not a power rake. We use a hand rake.
Yeah.
Or a bull rake.
A bull rake. I'm not familiar with a power rake.
Are we now done?
I think so.
Okay, with that,
Press on top.
with that, we have public comment. We had one person sign up. Leslie Potter.
Hey, should I stand?
Please stand and talk to us.
I'm Wesley Potter. I'm a commercial fisherman, member of the North Carolina Fisheries Association. Been commercial fishing all my life. And I pull the evil mechanical dredge for oysters every chance I get. First thing I wanted to say was the Colts planting program has been working out very well for us. I think the way that it's been handled, the planting that they've been doing over in our areas have been very productive. And I wanted to commend the state for their efforts in doing that. Regarding the deep oyster reef closures, I'm a skeptical on such a large area that's going to be taken in. I know they haven't been productive in years past. But I would like to know how much sampling has been done out there this year. Does anybody know that?
So, the only sampling that would be done on those deep water reefs, naturally occurring reefs, would be during trigger sampling. So for in-season management, I would say that if we were to adopt some sort of DORA, whatever the size, there would probably be some monitoring, some scuba monitoring involved with that. Or through other year patent ponds, to examine how the oysters are doing over time.
So right now for the trigger sampling, there should have been at least 4, unless they've gone out this week that I haven't got data back from, in those deep areas in the new Pamlico River, 4 events and 5 samples per event in each one of those. So they try to split the sampling 5 and 5 between bays and deep. And that's the trigger sampling setup that was adopted in 2010 by the commission. So that's how that.
So you're saying that it's been sampled out there in the deep water reefs 4 or 5 times this year?
I think 4 times.
Well then, did you know that the videos that you were showing on the screen that the reefs on the Pamlico River side look like the ones on the left? They're very much recovered.
We've definitely seen there are legal oysters out on the Pamlico reefs now for sure. And this is the first time since 2018 we've seen pretty much any legal oysters.
Yeah, well, there was oysters out there last year, but they were just a little small. This year, there was a tremendous amount of oysters out there on that whole stretch of reefs. The ones on the Neuse River side are loaded with spats. On the Neuse River side, they're recovered. I know that from personal experience. They've not been worked that hard because they did die off after the storm water events, and that's what's allowed them to recover. And a lot of the effort went down after them, after they died off out there. So that's where a lot of the effort went down. But they've recovered nicely, and we're gonna lose a lot of money if them areas are closed down. But I understand that what y'all are trying to do. I would just hope that if there is a closure implemented, that it would be a smaller area like you were talking about earlier, that you could, take a look at over a period of time and see how it's doing compared to the other areas. That would have a lot less impact on us, long term. And if it does in some way improve the reef, you could make changes to it later. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I ask Mr. Potter a quick question? If we please. How fast are the guys getting their limit right now? The couple I've talked to said at 10 o'clock in the morning, they've got their 15-foot.
That's about accurate.
In the culture. And the natural reef.
And the natural reef, yeah.
The area that they've got marked, they're working in that area right now.
Thank you. Okay, now we're gonna move to looking at voting recommendations for the Eastern Oyster Fishery Management Plan Amendment 5. So with that, I open discussion to the advisors to discuss and make recommendations for us to vote on. And Mr. Sharp, I hadn't heard out of you yet. If you're there.
I'm here. I'm just enjoying listening to you guys.
Oh, I can tell. I figured you'd have something to opine on this subject.
I don't write yet.
Okay. Well, we have options from staff, various ones from status quo to various ones. It's really up for y'all to.
Question. On the recreational one for.
We can talk about that first. I think that's the
Yeah.
simple thing. Talk about recreational.
What does this actually mean, explore, like? What are y'all gonna do with that?
So,
Are you looking to add it to the CRUFL as a requirement?
so, I mean,
Or recommend that it be added because it's outside the scope?
and so if that is to be, so we're looking basically at like, what can we do, period, kind of the entire scope, whether ranging from a permit to adding to the CRUFL, but each one of those has their own unique set of challenges for us to kind of jump through. And particularly like the CRUFL is gonna take legislative action and that may not ever occur. Creating a permit may be something we could do, but also may need legislative backing and you know, the issues with us administering that and that there's just, it's spider webs. We kind of looked at this initially, it just spiderweb really quick. So basically what we're asking for is to have the commission kind of give us direction and their blessing to kind of move forward and explore, turn over all the rocks and kind of outside of the FMP process, because if the
It's not
legislature's
part of
involved.
the FMP process. It's legislative.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not.
so that's why we're saying outside the process, because it may be something that we just can't, as much as we want to do, may take a long time.
So if we just encouraged division to explore options on the recreational side to see what is practical, feasible, and implementable in a reasonable time frame, that's all you're really looking for if we want to do anything?
Yeah, and the one aspect to the commission recommending this is it would sort of show that they've given their blessing, and that might help convince the legislature that it is time to do this.
Yeah.
Because they have the legislation, when the purple originated, this was considered, and they decided not to.
There's already a shellfish license in place though, right?
That is a
Commercial.
Non-commercial,
Yeah,
harvest shellfish,
This would add,
your 3 bushels, 4 bushels.
So that is.
that's a question too.
Right. But what I'm
This-
saying is
this
it
is
wouldn't be
first
that
step.
hard to implement a recreational license just for the harvest of shellfish, to limit the number of how many recreational guys you know, or, I mean, because let's be honest, with the exception of myself, I don't know that many rec guys that are gonna harvest oysters or clams for that matter.
Oh, I do clams.
Yeah, there's a number of people go.
People go, yeah.
But
we
not,
don't-
not the big numbers,
Well,
and
we
we
have-
look at the big recreational number to be licenses, whatever.
Yeah, we have no idea what it
We have
boils
no
down
idea.
to. But at the same time, I think you have no real authority right now. So it's gonna be a number of steps that they're gonna have to figure out of what is the best way. If us and division to say, commission want to do this, how do we skin the cat? And all we're saying is try to figure the best way to skin the cat. I think that's it, that the recreational should be understood in some way.
And I've got something I want to ask you, something like that. You were given the rationale for this thing about we can contact people if there's a closure. You know what I mean? So they're not looking for these signs, which I think people are used to the signs. But I believe that it's quite difficult even to inform the commercial folk about closures. How do you think that another tax license, when people can catch 100 clams or half a bushel of oysters, how are you planning to implement that?
So right now, you can go out and recreationally harvest, shellfish and not have any contact with the
Yeah.
division whatsoever.
50,
Never
100
look at,
clams.
you don't need a license, anything. So at least, a typical, when you get a recreational fishing license, you're provided with just the basic information of where to look, kind of basic limits. Right now, you don't need to do any of that for shellfish harvest. So it's kind of up to the public to educate themselves without even having kind of, that first step of here's where to look, just so you know, this shellfish sanitation concern with area closures is a thing. At least, when you receive a commercial license, you interact with the division and know that you have some basic, education where right now, with the recreational shellfish harvest, there's nothing. We have
I
no.
wouldn't say that's the truth. I would not say that's the truth.
So you're the
One of the
educated-
points-
Sam, you're the educated person here. You get somebody come down, who knows where, goes out there, so I'm location is the plans, and they just walk right on by the shellfish sign and poison themselves.
Well, I think that would have been reported a whole lot more than it has been for that to be a problem. I've never heard of such a thing occurring as that.
I think they're trying to, there's,
We would like to see zero.
there's
shellfish
always
deaths.
liability with this, and it's public water.
This
My
takes
thing
one,
is,
this
it's
takes
the
one
one-
bad case to really affect.
But-
It's
but I do
like
wanna
the
say-
one thing left, people,
Yeah,
that this state don't have their hands. Give me some money, give me some money. The last thing, that is it. That's
it
the
wouldn't
last thing.
necessarily cost money.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
could,
it could be just. a
it could
permit.
be an endorsement
Have you-
on your
yeah.
record.
Right. Well, we gotta have agents to sell this
Or
stuff. We got to do
We're spending a lot of
training.
time on the recreational one when this is like, we don't even know what this is really.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make a motion that we agree with this, whatever it is.
Second.
That we do
Whatever it
this
is.
and we let.
Okay, we got a motion.
For both the oyster and the clam, so we don't have to cover it again underneath the clam.
That basically,
They can go out and
Can we
can
do
come
that?
up with a.
yeah,
yes.
we can combine
Okay.
both of them together if we wish.
Yeah,
As long as
you
we're all
can.
unanimous on it.
Motion
That's
to
right.
agree with the division's
Staff
recommendation
recommendations.
on the recreation, to evaluate the recreational shellfish.
Yeah.
So I put some wording in here that's taken strictly from the presentation that they had in the decision document.
Yes.
This pretty much saying the same thing. Are you?
I'm good with the wording that you have there, yes.
Okay, with that discussion, do we have further discussion on the motion?
Quick question for clarification. And I do support the motion because I think we need data. If we're ever gonna do a stock assessment, we need to assess the impact. But I thought DMF and the commission were free to create permits, so if there is a quick answer to why you can't just do a permit, I appreciate it, if not, I understand, but I thought the division was free to create a permit, and require a permit for anything like this, so maybe I misunderstood.
Does it go back to something when the crumple was created?
Permit, no. The permit, it just creates a lot of stress on our license and statistics group because they have to issue the permits. We would need to set them up and we would need to have folks available. And if we could do it legislatively through a license or an endorsement or something like that, that would be better for division resources.
But if that failed,
Well, there's your-
DMF could create a permit and get this done, because I looked at the 2001 plan, as I said earlier, this was a question 23 years ago.
So.
A permit is so simple. 23 years ago, we could have created a Dagline permit, we wouldn't be talking about it now.
When we,
So I'm Brady Salmon. I'm the section chief for our licensing certificate section, so I might be able to tackle this question for you. So when they mentioned something about how we started going down this route and looking at the options and it got really tangled up really fast, it absolutely did. And so it isn't quite as simple when it comes to permits as it is for licenses. So for licenses, we have to go to the legislature and get legislation passed, just like they said. For permits, we can issue a permit through the commission, I think up to $100 fee. If the commission wants us to do that, the only issue is that all of our recreational fishing licenses are issued through the Go Outdoors that is managed by WRC. They are not managed by us.
Yeah.
And so for us to be able to do a license, that would be easier because we can just put it in the same system that all of the other licenses are in. But for a permit, it may have to go into the division's setup, and that is not developed whatsoever for the recreational sector. And that is talking a huge volume compared to the commercial sector. So we have way more recreational fishing public than we do the commercial side. And so to be able to have that sort of development, we would need money, we would need to have the plans to be able to do it that way. And it can get super complicated because then people don't know whether they should go to WRC or they should go to our website. You know, it spirals essentially. And so for us to be able to have the
I knew it was so
ability.
easy to create, or you had the authority to create the permit, and it just seemed like a simple solution, but everything's.
And so it would be beneficial if we could just have the ability to investigate a little bit more and sort of flesh out those like nitty gritty little details to make it easier to come up with a better solution.
Okay, further discussion? Hearing none, somebody call the question.
You called it, I seconded it.
Yeah,
We got the motion,
I
babe.
got the motion, yeah.
Okay, we're gonna call the question. All those in favor, raise your hands or say aye. Anybody opposed?
Nay,
Pam?
nay,
Okay.
no more taxes.
Sharon's not gonna vote because he doesn't need to, I don't think, in this case. So we have passed that. Now we're gonna move on to the oyster draft plan for consideration. What is the pleasure of this esteemed advisory board?
Are we gonna take this on issue by issue or as one?
Each one, because they're way totally different. We're talking about oysters.
And so right now we have up here the deep water oyster recovery areas, and kind of like Tom said, we can look at this. If y'all do want to kind of tie some of the stuff together, you're more than welcome to do that. But if you do want to do it issue by issue, where you decide if you are interested in deep water oyster recovery areas and just decide on that before we move on to the next one, it's however y'all want to do it.
I've got one question though, since this is the oyster fishery management plan. Nowhere in this have I seen it discuss the problem that we've got with all the proliferation of commercially raised oysters and water column leases, especially down in the south. You know, Pender County and Onslow County have just been inundated with that. Is that any mention of any of that in there? Does that not fall under the FMP?
So it's in there, but it's outside the scope of this FMP. So this FMP is going to be focusing on wild harvest only.
Okay.
I mean, one part is kind of how private culture operates now doesn't really rely on wild seed from either relay, because that has closed, or really, very few people plant mulch on their leases now. It's all in cage, kind of, it's a whole different ballgame. Also, the lease program is kind of, the vast majority of that is out of the purview of the commission now anyway, so they don't really have the authority to make those decisions anyhow.
Well, then who do? Because we literally have a big, big problem. And I've asked in previous meetings before, to please tell me what the saturation of the market is in terms of, if I've got 100 acres of bay, how many acres can I lease? And how many acres can be kept for recreational fishing, recreational kayaking, and what else? And I've never gotten an answer for that. And I would have thought that it is part of the oyster management system, isn't it? Because that value is determining what value is off the boat for the commercial guy as well, isn't it?
I mean, it certainly must impact the kind of economic side, but I don't think we have a good handle on that. But as far as kind of the public trust issue, what's the cap of, what ratio of leased to non-leased areas, I believe that's being worked on, but that's that's in the habitat section. And if Zach was here, I would throw him straight under the bus to you, but.
On that note, Mike, I'm happy to put you in contact with Zach to answer some of these questions.
Well, it's the same questions we've had for a year and a half, 2 years now.
Yeah.
I'm still asking.
So they still have to meet the same requirements, I'm assuming. There's no natural shellfish, clam, or oyster occurring. And
They have to get approved.
Yeah.
they have to post it.
And that's what that's how we've had to fight it,
is
is we've had to go through the approval process and point out, like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
You've got 10 acres here in a 20-acre
Exactly.
bay. Why do you want the other 10 acres? So
Yeah,
that's-
yeah, I completely agree.
That's
You
permit.
don't know how much.
That's,
what that
that's
is.
fine. I was just curious as to why it was.
Yeah.
And they
And
have
you
to
know, I
meet
quite
these
like y'all on that
production
stuff, too.
requirements, which are like nothing to meet those production requirements. And that is public bottom and it's being utilized like it belongs to somebody. But it does not belong to them.
Okay, that is off the subject. Now we're back
So,
on to where we are over here.
Dora, this appendix, I heard from a lot of us, and I was generally in agreement with this as well, is that closing off this entire area without having some either way of evaluating it or doing some sort of study first with a smaller area was not, that I don't think I was not, I don't know about the other folks, but I heard that from the side of the table. So I don't know if we can make a motion of some sort to say, we support this generally, but we want them to use a smaller area and make a study first.
Do a control area.
Do a control
with it.
area first before we just close off this entire area. We do some sort of other study to
That
understand
sounded
what
like
the
a
goals
motion,
are.
didn't it?
It was beginning to, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm proposing that before we proceed with this recommendation, that the division look at having a smaller control area to close and come back with a better understanding of what we're trying to do with this.
At the next FMP.
Yeah.
Because it'll take that
Next
long.
FMP or whenever they come out. We can say next FMP.
It'll
Yes.
take a little bit for them to even know anything.
What I'm just trying to
And
rationalize.
if somebody can help me with this, I'm open
That
to.
we would support a narrower, smaller, door or whatever you want to call it, narrow. And I believe, I mean, I've looked at it this way, there is a long spine, maybe you take a portion and split it and do a closed area, do a control area that's open whenever it's legally to be open, and study the impact. And then after the results of that, review that with the next FMP for, consideration. Is that sort of what you're trying to say?
That's what I'm trying to get to. And I don't know how much area that looks like,
Yeah.
but some.
But
much
y'all
smaller
figure that
area.
out. We're just giving a general idea, a smaller skinny down area and have, part open, part closed and.
Prove that it works.
Prove that it works before we come back with them.
Yeah, before you close off a huge area.
Preferably an area that's not currently being used.
Well, it's gotta be part of that spine where there's bed or it doesn't do a damn thing.
Right. It's got to be the general vicinity or they're
Yeah,
not going
it's got,
to.
you gotta look at, narrow it down.
I'm just saying, applying the same thing when you go get a shellfish lease, they're requiring you to prove that there's no shellfish there. I'm saying if you're gonna do this program in closed area, then prove to us that there's nobody using it before you close it.
Before
I
closing
think
the
that's
entire,
total,
before
I
closing
think
the
that's,
entire.
I hate to say, but I think
majority of
that's
the
off
area.
base because if you're gonna study a place that has
I would say
oyster
the
rock,
majority
you
of it,
have
because I
to
think we
have,
want this a lot smaller.
An oyster rock.
you gotta have oyster rock.
Yeah, they're not planting on this site, Ken.
They're not planting.
Closing.
They know the areas, they
Just
know
to
where
see
it
if it'll
is.
grow.
Take a small area and
Take
do
a small
a
area,
control
yeah.
study.
I don't know what would be a good percentage, but it needs to be much smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We had the motion.
Are you good with this motion as it's written?
That the AC enforce a narrow approach to the doors than what is described in the issue paper with the purpose of evaluating the effectiveness of the closure before closing the majority of the area, yes.
Do we need to
I
add
could-
control
if people
area
want
or
that-
something? I don't know. if we
Edit
need-
that or maybe open to suggestions.
You know the general concept of what we're talking about. Okay, we have the motion. Do we have a second of that motion?
I'll second.
We got a second. Okay, now we can have a discussion of this motion.
Tom, I'm gonna go ahead and apologize before I start this discussion. I don't know where it's gonna go, but. I voted on the last motion because I felt like it's kind of outside of the FMP, as y'all said. I've got huge concerns, as I mentioned earlier, about not having a stock assessment. Under state law, an FMP for a multi-year species, as I understand it, is required to have a stock status and a stock assessment. I personally question whether we actually have under state law an FMP here. So I know we lack data, I know issues, I know all that, but it just seems like rulemaking is more appropriate for something like this that could turn into a permanent closure. Y'all are well aware of my concerns about permanent closures and proclamations, but all that aside, I don't know whether the director or somebody can answer this question, because under state law, it says that a fishery management plan shall contain the necessary information, including stock status for relevant species and a stock assessment for multi-year species. We do not have a stock assessment or stock status for this species. Do we have an FMP here? And I don't know if that's something y'all can answer, but it gives me a lot of concern when we're acting through this fishery management plan, and it does not seem, we don't have that pivot point to say we should be doing this because we don't have a stock status that says it's necessary. Stock assessment, everything I read in the full document is more characterization of the commercial fishery and talking about the life history of the species and not the condition of the stock and why actions like this need to be taken. And I know time-wise, we probably don't want to get into hours-long discussion, but any insight you could provide that might make me feel better about voting on any of this would be helpful.
So we have other fishery management plans with species without stock assessments, but I'm gonna hunt this to someone at least 3 levels up the food chain.
And for the record, I'm concerned about those too.
Well, there's even higher up the food chain.
That's why I wanted to apologize. I knew the word might go, and I'll try to keep it short. I need some clarification on this.
Are we going up the food chain?
We're getting as high as you can get right now.
Wait on the bite.
I will say for shrimp, we don't have a stock assessment, and that's an annual species. It lives up to 2 years old.
I know, and as I delve more into state law,
I think that's for the commission to decide.
that's actually, the public can raise questions about whether the state is abiding by state law. I mean, in fact, they require us to abide by state law. It's our job to make sure that our state agencies are abiding by state law.
Glenn,
In
do you think
general
we could-
statute 113, 182.1 says each plan shall.
While they look it up, can we table this and continue?
We can, but
This is a question.
since.
This is a point of order is what this is, basically.
Yeah, and I just like clarification before I go voting on something as the FMP. Where do we stand without a stock assessment? And I'm happy to read the statute. I've got it written down here. And I'm sure the director is well aware of it. It just seems like a really weird place to be with a fishery management plan and no stock assessment, no stock status when it's required under law. Or seems to be to me. And again, I'm no attorney, but the attorneys I've talked to said shall mean must legally, and they seem to agree.
I mean, there is precedent for managing species. We have many that are under traffic lights, not necessarily full-blown stock assessments. So we do have trends in the data that we can assess to give us an idea of what's going on within a fishery. And that's what we have done here. And that's, I believe, what we're using to fill that statutory guideline is.
Well, while we wait to hear, can we have further discussion? We'll come back and elaborate this when appropriate. Anybody else have on what we're looking at here
So
with this motion?
So what is under the stoplight that there's no stock assessment for?
And can we get into discussing the particular
Well, you
motion
said
on the
this
floor?
one, that is the motion.
That
How
is
are we
the
supposed
motion.
to vote on it?
But we have to
Go
have
ahead.
discussion up to the point y'all don't want to have any further discussion, then we get to vote on it.
I'll
I
be happy to start
noticed.
discussion on this. I just ain't ready to vote, but,
Well, we ain't voting
yeah,
right now.
yeah,
Do you have an answer
Yeah.
for us?
I don't know if I have an answer that's gonna suit you, but I have an answer. So to Glenn's point, the FMP is developed based on the fact that it has been identified as a significant fishery. There is nothing in statute that requires a stock assessment for any of the species. We don't have a stock assessment for shrimp or any of the other annual crops. We don't have a stock assessment for kingfish. There are other, examples of areas where we have to use different tools besides stock assessment. So we don't agree with the determination that you have to have a stock assessment for a species. So for that piece, I definitely we do not.
In this case, we're
Yeah.
using land use as our stock assessment as to where the stock is.
we don't have a.
That's something.
No, we don't have. There's no stock assessment for this species, so, I mean, we don't have that. We've been using trigger, management for this, but it's not an abundance metric. So, I mean, that's just where we are. We have been working on a stock assessment. I not know how close we are or are not to having that developed, but it is absolutely something that we've been working on. And just to further the conversation about stock assessments, the Division of Marine Fisheries has been looking for a stock assessment scientist now for over a year. We don't have a stock assessment scientist on staff, haven't had in a year, almost a year.
Since May of
And our discussions are now currently in the event that we may not be able to hire a stock assessment, how will we monitor some of these stocks? And some of that could be more trigger analysis, more, other approaches to determining stock status or some sort of stock abundance outside of a stock assessment. So in my 29 years here, I don't remember ever going through a term where we didn't have a stock assessment person on staff, but it is an issue. So we do not think that the law requires a stock assessment, but certainly you would like to have stock status and stock abundance as you go through management, but you may not always have that as in a definitive thing like a stock assessment.
And you just use some other thing as a trigger.
Yes.
Just some other thing, whatever.
Yeah, I think somebody talked about the traffic light for blue crab. I mean, we've managed
Right.
blue crab by traffic light for how long?
At least whenever.
Yeah, long time. So, and we finally got a stock assessment for blue crabs. We worked on that a long time. So, it
It's from, because they project the trends for blue crabs. What is trending or, whatever. Guess that's sort of, is that based on landings at all?
So the traffic light, I don't know exactly what went into the traffic light for blue crabs, but there's different data sets that went into the traffic light for blue crabs, but and now we have a, full-blown stock assessment for blue crabs. So that's a advancement for us in that particular species. And we'd like to have one for kingfish. We worked on one, but it didn't, we didn't get where we needed to go. And maybe next time.
That's the most interesting thing I've heard tonight. Thank you.
I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Okay, discussion on the motion.
Had to get to the bottom of things, Tom. Okay.
Do we have further discussion on this?
No.
I'll say personally, I do support this. I think that a skinny down control area will give you some information. I don't think it's gonna cause an undue hardship for the occasional year that it may be productive, which is gonna be very occasional. It's not gonna be a hardship, and I think the benefit of science understanding this outweighs that, the little loss of production that would occur, provided it's a small controlled area. That's my opinion.
I can say I'm much more comfortable with a control and, having it there to compare versus closing that entire area. And then if there's no change or if there's change across the whole board, you don't know if it was because it was closed or not. Yeah. So I'm more comfortable with that. And we did hear from a member of the public that if there was going to be a closure, he preferred it to be much smaller I would just add from my part that I would prefer that it be as small as possible, as far as that shell bottom until you identify that it's beneficial to close more areas.
Clint, could we make a thing that says supports a significantly narrower approach? So that
That's
it-
what I was
Yeah,
really trying to
And
figure
I,
out.
and I can take, and I'm happy to take that into the motion.
I
if
was
you want to do
considering
that.
making an amendment
Okay.
to that effect, and you actually helped me with wording,
Okay.
because that's what I was hoping to.
Significantly narrow.
Significantly narrow, but I think we don't want it to be half. I think y'all want it to be 10% or some. I don't know what they need to decide what
Yeah,
that
they
is.
gotta
but
figure it
but
out,
It can't
I
be
thought.
half. It needs to be somewhat, a lot less than what it is now.
And that would be, I just want to make sure we relay to the commission that we want this to be a test with a control, and we don't want to take into a vast area until we see it beneficial. Obviously, if y'all come back later down the road and something beneficial has happened, this discussion comes back to everybody and we get results and determine it needs to be bigger, so.
And I would suggest two changes. One says significantly narrower approach, and the other one I would say evaluate the effectiveness of the closures before considering closing the majority of the area. So that there is another evaluation, whether that's in the next FMP or whatever, but it needs to, before we even consider closing it, not you can see the output and close it. I don't know.
Michael, are you good with those changes as well, since you were the seconder?
Yeah. Okay.
As small as possible, but large enough to be statistically relevant.
Yeah. Okay. Further discussion? If not, the question is called, and those in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Those opposed? Okay. The motion,
Tom, I support the motion.
okay. No opposition. Okay. Now we're moving on to vote to recommend management options for the draft Heart and Clam Fishery Management Plan Amendment 3 for F Marine Fisheries Commission consideration.
There was another one about.
Oh, there is another one in there. I'm sorry. We're still on the door. We just did the door. We need to get to the second phase. I'm sorry. I'm trying to move on. It's late. Let's go to.
So this one is about the culture supported harvest. That is strategy 2 in the decision document. It's the one that is the valuing habitat and the fishery value equally.
Clarification, the division recommended this one and the other one with the rotational, that focus.
Yeah, the rotational harvest is, will be next.
Yeah.
So it's not either or, we're not picking this one or the.
To be all, none, one of each.
Show the next one so we can see what's coming up. So there's two recommendations for the remaining part. One is rotational, the other is just the, go back to the first one. And I assume it's probably going to be easier to address these one at a time, even though they don't have to be mutually exclusive, I believe. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, I have another question. This isn't necessarily planting more cult sites, it's just management of the current.
Changing how we currently manage, so how the trigger sampling happens now, it's changing that approach, is how we implement that. Setting the season lengths. Right now, it's based on real-time monitoring. This would be a preseason, set a fixed season, go out, sample once more, and modify if needed. And in the paper, it shows you how we determine those season lengths based on the past data, as well as there's a table in there of what those actual fixed season lengths would be based on the preseason conditions. So adopting the strategy as proposed would be like endorsing everything that's in strategy 2 in that paper. So the table, like the fixed season, the actual season lengths, and the steps that we said, like having industry reports, preseason sampling, setting season length, in-season industry reports, in-season sampling, and then modify. So like that series of steps plus the season lengths that are set up in table whatever it might be in the paper now. It was 10, I don't know what it
With
is.
the idea of giving them better guidance of what your season's gonna be, not just be arbitrary.
Yeah, so it'll be, the benefit of this, it would give them a better idea in the very beginning, okay, we're proclaiming the season to be, 10 weeks in the Hyde area. And then it may be modified halfway through if in-season reports come in and show that there's still the oyster resources at whatever level, 10 weeks would get you in that table.
But would you?
If it comes in under, it would stay at that, so there's no taking back.
So
Once
you
do
wouldn't
that
go
first
less than
season.
10 weeks?
It would be
or
10
8
weeks.
or 6 or whatever.
Yeah, it would be that first season, and then so say, there's also provision there, if it comes back, because there's a threshold in there. If it comes back less than 10%, the season would not open. But then it still allows one more chance to give us feedback, and if we go out sample again and actually find areas above 10%, then we would open it for how many ever weeks that's appropriate based on that tape. So we tried this approach. We really kind of worked with the Oyster Advisory Committee to kind of refine what we had initially put out to kind of get to this spot.
Is this for new planted areas or old planted areas in?
This is for all of the mechanical harvest areas in Pamlico Sound. So how we would manage mechanical harvest
Pamlico Sound.
across
I was
Pamlico
thinking
Sound.
New River because I hadn't been planted in 30 years.
There's been significant mulch planting in New River.
That's news to me.
Yeah, all the way up down the bank, yeah.
And we put a
Yeah,
lot,
I
a
know.
lot of
There's a lot
material in
went
New
in there
River.
30 years ago.
But the discussion is on mechanical harvest. Is what we're talking
Primarily.
how to
in
manage
Pamlico.
mechanical harvest.
Only in Pamlico Sound. That's the only place where.
That's where it's allowed, right?
If
I'll
we
make the
wouldn't-
motion to
It's not
adopt that.
changing, season lengths, any of the management that's been set up to this point, as far as where harvest can occur, what the bushel lengths are, the split season in the base, all of that would carry forward. The only difference is we're looking to change how we set those season lengths. So instead of going from kind of a reactive, okay, hit this point, issue a proclamation, close, coming up with a way to have more stability in the season. And it's a lot less sampling for us instead of having to go out there. So the thought process behind that on our side is that hopefully not having to spend so much time doing the trigger sampling, we can actually start answering some of those questions and the data needs we need to do a stock assessment. So getting at some of the stuff that we don't have time to do now.
Okay. He's wanting to make a motion.
I'll make a motion to accept the division's recommendations.
So I pasted that wording in there, straight from the decision document, to recommend that the Marine
Perfect.
Fisheries Commission adopt the proposed culture-supported harvest strategy as described in the Mechanical Oyster Harvest Management Issue Paper. Perfect with that.
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a second. Now we can have a discussion.
I have a quick question. The one commenter we had tonight didn't really touch on this issue, although he did commend y'all on the strategy that's going on now. Now, I have had a lot of calls about the closures for some of these areas in the past, so I'm just questioning, did you have comment last night in support from the public? I was on the way back from Raleigh. I didn't get to listen to the meeting, so I don't know if anybody supported, opposed this, gave some rationale, because we really didn't get much public comment, or if the chairman would allow me to ask our one. I would just love to hear some feedback from somebody that works these areas on whether this sounds better to them or they prefer the old strategy.
So we didn't get any public comment about this last night. But we did have the advisory committee voted to approve this. The deep water oyster recovery areas, you can imagine how that went over. So they did not approve those, recommend those, and they liked the rotational culch approach. And there were two mechanical harvesters from Pamlico Sound there.
There were some strong opinions about the current trigger sampling.
Yes.
So
And I've heard that in the past,
I
and
think they want certainty as much as they can get, and I think this is aiming for
I
it.
mean, one key piece of this, what's proposed here too, is having that industry participation by providing us areas. Because right now, we try and, talk to people and ask, and getting a specific coordinate is very hard. It's like, oh, just go here. Like, well, here is very large.
I get that, and I've had questions about 26%. They said, well, there could be 100 million oysters there. And if 26% aren't, you know, if we hit that threshold, it doesn't matter that there's 70 million that are legal, we can't harvest. But
And so
I've had questions about that.
that is one issue with the 26% is there is no metric of abundance in there. So that's something, hopefully, this is step one, I'm hoping. In the next plan, we can get to something a little better, but I think this is an improvement over where we're at. It's not quite where we probably need to be, but it's a step. And again, this will let us kind of at least look into different ways of doing maybe some sampling and collecting more data to get those abundance estimates that we don't get now.
Would the chairman allow the one commenter we have to just say quick whether he prefers current?
Well, we've already had comments closed.
I understand that, and that's, and I've been in the audience before and Sharp's allowed me to answer questions, so that's why I asked.
I'm in, I hate to say it, I'm in time mode right now, given how long this has gone. Any
And
other
the
questions?
Northern Committee
from
passed
our-
this, you
Any
said?
comments from our esteemed advisors on this question? If not, we're going to proceed to vote. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No opposition, there's an abstention. And with that, we go on to the third one,
The
rotational planning. Fred, did you vote?
I approve. If I'm silent, it means I'm in compliance here.
Okay.
I did, so Tom, just if you permit me just 30 seconds, just to provide a little context to what you guys were talking about before about the stock assessment. You know, just most people are familiar with the history of the oyster fishery in Chesapeake Bay. It goes back to the late 1800s and the challenges with doing a stock assessment for oysters. Their first assessment didn't occur until 2018, a formal stock assessment after over 130 years of management. And that occurred because it was federally funded and it was actually conducted by the University of Maryland, not the state agency. And the model is stage-based, it's not age-based. And they have a really reliable fall dredge survey as a fishery independent index that feeds that survey. So just to provide some context with how challenging it is to do a stock assessment for oysters.
Thank you, Fred. Okay. Now we're down to rotational culch site strategy. What is y'all's pleasure on discussing this?
Y'all discuss.
You'll be back before
I'll be
we
back
do any
to
voting, I'll make sure.
They recommended to adopt the rotational culture site strategy.
The northern.
And that's these 10-acre plots you were talking about?
And I believe the comment was it's addition by addition. Was the general.
If y'all will
Is that
finish
what?
those number of
Well,
sites
it
by
makes sense to me
26.
to rotate them through because of, that way not everybody's.
Yeah, they used to do clam kicking areas like that. They rotated them around. I know where at on that one, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very flexible.
And I look at this.
And just the rotational harvest strategy for scallops up in New England is probably, you know, one of the most successful management approaches, you know, that we know of over the last 2 or 3 decades in terms of these rotating open and closed areas for a non-mobile shellfish species. So.
And this gives industry a lot more certainty of what will be open in the coming
Yeah,
season.
the way this is proposed is there will be one 10-acre site open the entire season, no matter what. In each management area, so 40 acres across the sound every year, no matter what, for the entire possible mechanical harvest season.
In this basin's a put and take fishery.
Yeah.
That's what this is. This is put and take.
And right now we're committing to 16 sites because that's what the Habitat Enhancement Program can build with current funding. But if this is a strategy that works and the funding is ongoing, we could very easily expand that to more sites. So this is kind of step one with our toes in the water of a rotational strategy.
I move to recommend to adopt the rotational cul-de-sac strategy.
Okay, we have a motion to adopt,
I'll second.
and we got a second. Now we can have discussion. Anybody have comments on the rotational harvest plan recommended by the division?
If it proves successful, can you do it to other already existing shellfish areas, planted areas?
That could be something we look at, in the future and the next plan. If this works really well, it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to new plantings. We could, or even in intertidal areas in the south, it's something we could move forward to. But this is definitely kind of step one, seeing how it goes.
No, I was thinking, the gardens in New River, they're all the way down, all the way up to the creek and then round back down the other side.
Any other comment? Hearing none, calling the question, and all those in favor say aye, or raise your hand.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Hearing none, we are passed. Now, I guess, does anybody on the advisory board have any questions for them before I ask them to tell us what's going on next? Tell us what's going on next.
All right, do y'all have anything else that you need to talk about with Oyster as far as adaptive management or?
Slide.
Because we covered everything, didn't we?
We do have to still talk about the adaptive management.
Since you recommended adopting that approach to, it's this slide. This slide, pocket slide 40 something. It's 52, geez. It's down there. So since you recommended to adopt that culture supported harvest strategy, there's just one piece that since the fixed season lengths were based upon the years 2017 onward because of the kind of relatively stable participation during that time, and that's kind of representative to what's happening now. If the participation in the mechanical fishery grows or shrinks, the fixed season lengths in the table in that paper that we've come up with based on that data may not be applicable anymore. So just kind of as a means of being flexible between the plans, if we see a huge jump in participation in the fishery, or people just drop out and there's less people in the fishery. So that would be a change of 25% either way. So either the running average, the 3-year running average of 70 or greater, or less than 116. We'd calculate during the annual FMP update. That would just trigger us looking at our season lengths and evaluating, looking at basically, what we've issued for seasons the past couple of years compared to our data, and if that needs to be changed. It wouldn't trigger any changing, but it would just let us be a little flexible to be able to maybe decide that we actually, okay, there's way less people in this fishery now. We don't need to be as conservative, but we can have a longer fixed season length because it ends up, we keep every time, we end up having to modify the season and add like 6 weeks every time. So instead of going through that, we can modify our fixed season table. And this, if we saw that change in participation, would let us do it. Or kind of direct us to examine it. And then I imagine the commission will like to approve that or not, but that's not in there. Yes.
Can you even do that? Because that looks an awful lot like a cap. Participants.
It's not a cap. It's just telling us that the level of participation in the fishery has changed from based on what we made our fixed seasons on. So how the fixed seasons were determined, we went back and looked at the preseason condition for all these management areas versus how many weeks we actually got out of them. And there's a pretty good relationship of how, if it started at 30%, you get 6 weeks out of it. So based on that, we just came up with a table. So if we, the early, the preseason condition, and then we'll issue a season like that. But if the participation in that fishery changes a lot more than from that data we had during that time, what people were actually out there then. So say it triples, right? There's going to be way more people out there than were when we came up with those fixed season lights. So
Isn't there a permit schedule for that?
it's, yeah, you need a shellfish, you need a shellfish endorsement on the commercial license, but there's no cap other than
There used to be a whole drag.
you need a standard commercial fishing license with a shellfish endorsement. It used to be the shellfish only license could go out there and do it before 2010, and that was wide open essentially. So there is a cap, but it's capped by the number of standard commercial fishing licenses.
Yeah.
You can't draw out of that the number of participants when the license sales occur.
Yeah, we will know. So basically all of this will be doing is we'll be following the number of participants. And if we see a change, either way, it'll trigger us to like look at our season lengths that we've adopted and decide, looking back at the data that we have, are they still appropriate or not? So it doesn't.
I'm trying to figure out where you're getting your participation level. Is it from license sales?
It's from trip ticket land.
Trip ticket land, okay.
Yeah.
From the previous year.
Yes, and so this
you're
will
gonna
be
project
done.
and say there's so many gonna fish it this year.
It's just we're looking at if there's a change in participants making landings in the fishery overall. So, and even if there's one big spike one year, it's the 3-year running average. So basically, is participation in this fishery changed past what it has been? And the only thing that'll do is trigger us to just look and see, what we're doing still appropriate? And then go from there.
In other words, it's shellfish endorsement on it, okay? But I've never dragged forward.
So it would be only people with landings using that mechanical gear.
Okay, why can't you, at the time of the license sale, how come you just can't ask for a permit to drag forward?
Because you might not actually use that permit and participate in the fishery. Yeah. They're looking for actual participation, whether you landed with mechanical harvest. My question is, you said this triggers you to look. If you decide to take action, does this action have to come back for public comment, come back to the commission, or is it at the sole discretion of the director? That's usually outlined in adaptive management. I didn't see it here.
Usually it's the director.
Yes, and it's not expressly written in here, but I'm guessing it's gonna have to go back to the commission just based on how the commission views adaptive management.
And on that note a little bit, though, if you wanted to make a motion to support adaptive management, you could make it with the caveat that the advisory committee recommends supporting the adaptive management as described in the issue paper, with the caveat that any adaptive management has to go back to the advisory committees or has to go back to the commission. Like the advisory committee could recommend that.
But typically like that, is there enough time for that to be effective?
So we initially, in developing this issue, had this adaptive management in consultation with the advisory committee, but that was the concern that the advisory committee scheduled.
You could be months behind.
So that was the thought process of removing that consultation piece out and just having it be flexible. But again, I suspect that if this is adopted by the commission, that there'll be some sort of piece in there where we go back to them. But as written now, there's not.
And
we're just making it.
I like flexibility. I always get concerned when it's kind of vague like this and you don't have something that specifies you're going to look at abundance. Or, because just the effort increase triggers you to look at it. But what parameter decides whether you shorten season? I mean, if there's increase in effort, but there's a huge increase in abundance of oysters, obviously it probably doesn't present a problem, but it's just kind of vague. And
yeah, that's what they would take in account.
That's what I hope they would take into account. I just like to have it outlined.
You gotta put that in there too. I would think this is at the stage of fine tuning. This is
And we
general terms right now.
We can make a motion with that too and say they need to look at consider abundance with in conjunction with that. I mean, I think you could make that a motion.
So what other fishery have we specified? Basically, what's the cap? And you say what you want to. What other one have we said that we could have only greater than or lesser than 70 than 116 or any other number? What other one?
So
I didn't remember another one.
this isn't limiting participants. It's just if participation goes one way or the other, it's just having us look back.
It's setting off triggers. It's setting off a trigger. Says it right
But
there.
it's not a trigger to actually do anything, it's a trigger to review. That's it. And review could
And they
be
can't limit participation, they can shorten the season.
that they look at it and say, okay, well, we don't have as many people as we had for the last number of years. And we can add 2 more weeks to the season.
Well, that's all pretty.
All we
But
would do is-
I wouldn't want this to be used on other fisheries. I mean, yeah, I can kind of get it. I do get it. But I don't want this, well, it worked here, so let's try it over here type thing. That's what I don't want.
I just wanna, I think we might be looking at this the wrong way. This is just to determine the season length for the culture supported harvest areas. If there's more people in the fishery, the rocks are gonna be depleted sooner, so we'll
And
need
you're
to
gonna
close
cut
it
off
sooner.
on the other end.
And if there's less people, they'll be depleted probably in a longer period of time, so then we would extend the season, so participation.
And your
drops.
mid-year trigger thing's gonna catch it anyway, right? Your mid-year sampling,
The mid-season,
The
yeah,
mid-season.
sampling would, so basically like, it's say, less people were in the fishery, because I mean, participation has been generally declining, with a little uptick recently, but say participation drops out below that 70. How it would set up now, basically, the preseason or the mid-season sampling would show, okay, that season length that we proclaimed was way too conservative because we have a ton of oyster resource left based on the percent legal. So we could go ahead and add this many weeks. So it would happen anyways in the in how it's going to be administered, but this would let us just change that so we don't have, it would be basically so you'd get that longer season in the beginning. But conversely, it's also, if it exploded, we wouldn't be stuck proclaiming a season length that's just going to be way too long for how many people are in the fishery. So if it tripled in effort, we wouldn't be then proclaiming a season that's too long and having it go well below that 26% legal by the time.
How are you determine the trip to where the oysters come from? In other words, if they came from those gardens with a set number of people, and you could say the season could be so long. But how, if the oysters came from another location in the same water body, how would you?
So right now, the trip ticket landings for Pamlico Sound, we can't split out. The water body code is Pamlico Sound essentially. So we have a very rough scale of where we can parse landings to. But this would be mechanical harvest in Pamlico Sound, period. So just a really broad look, not trying to break it down into the trigger sampling. Basically, the season lengths are split between bays, the 10 bushel a day bays, and the 15 bushel a day everywhere else there. So that's how the season lengths were kind of looked at.
Any other discussion on this?
Just one point, we mentioned earlier that having these set seasons and looking in the middle of the season allowed you to extend the season but not shorten it. That allows you to come back and.
This is the fail safe if we see that it's just, we got this way wrong, or people have, the effort is really expanded in that fishery and the fixed season lengths wouldn't be applicable anymore because the fixed season lengths are developed based on that level of effort.
And your desire for this is because it would be quicker than a supplement or an amendment.
Yes, and I mean, honestly, between plans is only 5 years and we're looking at a 3-year running average, so it's really just a fail safe if something crazy happens in the next couple of years where we just get people. Our rotational harvest approach is a great success and people just want to jump in and then there's so much participation. I mean, that's really what this is, kind of a fail safe.
The economy is going to determine how many oysters you harvest too. So, and the
Last
price,
time it was over 116.
price goes up, you're gonna have more harvest.
So that the 25% around that hasn't happened in the entire time series that are basically before.
There's never been 160.
Oh, there has been, but it was before 20. I forget now, but it's been a while.
20 years.
2000, 2010, 2012. It really dropped out when you had to have the commercial license on.
So it was 12. So it's been 12 years since it's been above that.
And I mean that level of participation was there because that shellfish only license is open to anyone who wants to get it. So there's no cap on that.
Yeah.
And it was a year where there was a ton of oysters in one place and everyone jumped in because the prices were really high and just went in and did it.
Okay. We have a motion, don't we?
No, we have not made.
We have not made the motion yet?
No.
Okay, somebody want to make the motion? This has been
I'll
a
make a
long
motion that we support the adaptive management.
Adaptive management.
Adaptive management.
A second.
And we got a second.
The recommendation in the thing, it doesn't seem like it's a very big risk and it seems like it will prevent a 3 years.
It seems unnecessary with his last comment and given earlier we were talking about one of the advantages was that mid-season would allow them to extend the season but not shorten it. So, normally I supported that demand, but this time I can't vote for it. It just doesn't make sense to me that it's necessary.
Do we have a second? Did we get a second?
I
on this?
second.
Yeah, we got a second. Okay, I want to make sure. Sometimes I have hearing aids and I don't hear everything. I wanted to make sure I do see it's on the board. We have discussion. We have further discussion. If there's no further discussion, I call the question. All those in favor say aye. Anybody opposed?
No.
No.
Four opposed.
How many's opposed?
4 opposed.
4
3 nays.
opposed.
Are you abstaining? Are you?
Well, I don't vote unless there's a tie.
How about Fred?
Brad, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I support the motion.
So now it's a tie.
Now it's a tie. The chair votes for the
I
motion.
thought Fred was gonna bring it. I'm sorry. I wouldn't have brought it up.
The chair will vote for the motion, so it passes. And we've now done everything on the agenda.
No, we gotta do the clam.
Plan.
Oh, we hadn't done the clam.
Nope, we haven't done the plan.
Lord,
We have done the oysters. Now we're down to the clam. We've already done the recreational part,
I
right?
agree with you. It's probably
So we're down
unnecessary for that.
to
Fail safe, I guess.
draft hard clam clam fishery management plan amendment 3 for consideration. Show us what our recommendations are or options. Please.
Lord,
I'm tired. I'm driven
me too.
300 odd miles
I
today.
feel for you. I apologize.
You've been on a journey, Tom.
I have.
You got to get the rest. So
We
while we're
already
waiting
voted
on
on the
Tiger Eyes.
recreational one.
I'm waiting to get it up on the screen.
Yeah.
Like I
We
say,
used to wait for it to fall.
Josie, do you have this one?
We already did
there
the
we go.
recreational.
Like 25.
Wait for it to fall, see what it rise and die from.
The tide has been the lowest I have seen since Florence
It's been
this
down
week.
there.
Okay.
I mean, it is ebbed out.
We have 4 management options. We have 2 division recommendations. We can take these one by one on management options and look at them that way. Or we can look at the division.
I'd like to make a motion that we maintain status quo.
We have a motion to maintain status quo.
I'll second it.
And Pam has seconded.
Of course. I'll vote it.
Discussion on the status quo.
Was it second by Pam or was that by?
Pam was the first
He was
one to
the
second. He was the third.
As the maker of the motion, I'll keep it short, but the reason I support status quo is I think it sets a dangerous precedent when you look at the value of fishery and determine that because it's not extremely valuable now or not as valuable as it was in the past, that you should just phase out a gear. And I know there was other considerations that you had in that, but I feel that is a very dangerous precedent to set in managing our fisheries, just because there's not a lot of current value to the state.
Okay, further discussion. We got one, I guess he's gone to the first room too. Anybody else want to make a comment on this? I'm not gonna go any further until he returns. You have any discussion on this? The motion is status quo, do nothing, leave it the way it is.
Oh.
Tell us your opinion on that.
Jesse,
If you have an opinion you wish to discuss in public.
The PowerPoint slide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
I feel like I don't feel grounded enough in the information really. That I have a strong opinion, so I'm kind of.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with phase out.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. I mean, I just, and I understand the idea about not just basing it on value. I look at the environmental impacts as well, and I realize there's a million different things that impact the environment, not just this, but I look at the impact on the environment and then phasing it out.
And you know, in my area where we used to see it a lot, we don't see it anymore. Everybody's full of bull, right?
Yeah, and yeah, down south, I don't think it's open down there anyway, right? Mechanical and.
There's an area in the intercoastal waterway that's open.
And where's that?
That's the only place it's
Yeah, I
ever
can
been.
pull up a map if you'd like.
No, just approximately. Is it
South of 172 bridge.
south of the one?
That's up my way,
Yeah.
not your way. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's
South of the ones near, so in New River?
in New River. Yeah, that's the only other place I know that you'll ever see it. And I haven't seen it that much for a very long time.
Oh, and they said
I
White
spend
Oak
that
River
much time
every
on water.
It used to be a big sound, but they did away with it.
And to me, when you're looking at the possible impact of this, you really have to consider how limited it is. Everybody just said they don't see it. Then we have very small areas that it's actually allowed, and those areas were picked because they minimize the impacts. As you saw the North River, they moved it away from the grass farther. They have continually minimized the impacts in this fishery, and to phase it out, it probably isn't gonna have no huge beneficial impact on anything, but it will have a huge economic impact on a handful of people. Like say $20,000 out of your income for 3 people or whatever it happened to be is significant.
I'm just
understand.
worried about the opposite thing, which is that people get back into it for some reason. That's all.
Well, the phase out, I feel like it's gonna cause them to get back into it.
It's possible, I guess. I mean, I see that point too. I see that point too.
You take the idea of government telling somebody they can't make.
Only
a
areas,
certain
only
way
areas that
because
are
nobody else
mechanical
is.
harvesting.
Yeah.
There's
that's-
extremely high water flow there. Anything that's stirred up. Right out there.
And to your point, this fishery may see growth in the future, and the FMP allows for us to come back and look at that growth and decide whether it needs to be managed or whether it's having impacts. But those 3 guys and that 40 to less than $75,000, I don't know what it is, it's significant to them, and they could not be having a massive impact, those 3 guys. If you do the phase out, it encourages at least 10 to get into the fishery to keep it from being phased out or have the opportunity. Right now, if you don't do anything, you think a bunch of people are just gonna jump in?
Probably not.
Yeah, and it's it's such a minimal thing. It's, I mean, you know, it'd be like me targeting the tarpon fishery because it's not a huge fishery in the state. Some guys love to do it. Most people have never even tried it, but.
Have it in North Carolina.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So I just, and I'll rest at that, but I just can't see any huge benefit from doing it, but I can see a massive impact for a couple of guys economically. And I can tell you, there's been winners win an extra $15,000 or $20,000 that got me through to the spring. Was a massive deal. You know, so that's where I'm at.
Okay, so we got a motion.
We have a motion, don't we? Yeah, and a second. Anybody else want to comment on the motion?
Hey guys, I just, wanted to say that I agree with what Glenn just said. That the behavior is really difficult to predict, and putting in a phase out can alter behavior in ways that, may end up causing more problems down the road than you have now. And so, it's definitely a reason to consider just leaving it alone.
My only thought on this is if we get to a situation where there's nobody participating, I think it'd be then an appropriate time to finish it off. But until then, I don't have an overwhelming driving issue, even though I understand the bottom disturbing gear, which I hate. I'll just say that I hate bottom disturbing gear, but this is minimal. So with that, anybody else want to make a comment? If not, call question. All those in favor of the motion of status quo, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
I'm gonna abstain.
We got one opposition and one abstention. So
I support it.
and Fred supports, so this passes.
You got to read those one more time for me. What was the breakdown?
Yes. I voted nay.
He's nay, he's abstained.
Would you like to just do a roll call vote real fast? We'll
Do
get
a
it.
roll call.
Awesome.
Make it easy for him.
That's good.
Abstain.
I made all of these like pretty tables here. I gotta use it at least once.
Those are real good when we're doing this virtual. They work great.
Let's use them once.
I'm abstaining from this vote.
All right. And Mike
I voted
Appengarder?
nay.
Pam Morris?
Yes. Aye.
That's it. And Ken Siegler?
Aye.
Glenn Skinner?
Aye.
Jeremy Skinner?
Aye.
And Tom Smith?
I'm the chair. I don't need to vote unless there's a tie.
So you're abstaining.
And Tim Wilson is absent.
And
Michael
Mr.
Yates?
Shaw.
I'm aye.
And Mr. Sharp?
Yeah, and I vote yes.
Okay, so you got the number. Okay, then we did status quo, which we don't need to go through the other ones. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yay.
Yay.
Want to make sure I'm not out of line here.
I'm saving you time.
No, I just want to make sure if we do this, we don't need to consider the other. With that, anybody from the committee have questions for staff? Can staff tell us what we got coming up or any update from the division or whatever y'all wish to discuss with us?
So I can,
Illuminate us.
I'd love to go on and on and on and talk a bunch, but I'm pretty sure I'll get beat up in the parking lot if I do that. So I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So I just want to give you a quick update on what happened at the previous Marine Fisheries Commission meeting. The commission did select their preferred management options for spotted sea trout. I won't take the time here to go into the specific management options that they selected, but if you're interested, you can go to the division website. We have that information, or if you want, just let me know and I can email all that to you. They will be voting in February to actually adopt the FMP for spotted sea trout.
Jesse, when will that take effect?
Pretty soon after it is adopted, we'll begin the implementation of it. I do want to update y'all a little bit on the 2025 schedule for your meetings. we're wanting to try something new, and I would like some feedback from the committee members on it. You don't have to give it to me right now. If you don't want to, if you're ready to get out of here, you're more than welcome to call or email me. But we're wanting to try having some virtual meetings, maybe say a week prior to the meeting that you would typically have, like say if we did it with this meeting, a week ago, we would have held a virtual meeting that was a joint meeting of all of the advisory committees. And at that virtual joint meeting, we would give the presentations that you received tonight and have the discussion and the questions that y'all had prior to the public comment, the questions that are specific to the actual presentation. We would have that at that virtual meeting. And then a week later, we would actually have our in-person meeting where we would give a brief overview of the presentation just to refresh everybody's memory. But then that's where the actual deliberation on the different options and the voting would take place at that meeting.
The
And
public comment would be then.
the public comment would be then, yes, sir. There is the potential for us to allow some level of public participation in the virtual part,
It'd be tough.
especially with all of the committees meeting at once. It would probably get rather long.
But this would be the same presentation that we'll see at the following meeting, so it gives us a chance to digest it and contact staff with questions.
Exactly, yeah.
Basically, you're flushing out any questions you might have and getting them out in the open before you come back to.
And really, it's really interesting to me. Being an advisor is a really tough job. We give you the materials a couple weeks in advance, but it's a lot. Like an FMP is a big document, and for this meeting, y'all had 2 of them, and to expect y'all to digest that information and then come to this meeting, receive these presentations, and then make up your mind at that same time, that's a very difficult job that y'all have. So we're hoping that this really makes it a little bit less daunting for you, and really you'll have the time and the opportunity to think about the presentation that you've seen, talk to people, really digest that information before you actually have to come back to the table and provide your management recommendations.
Can I make one quick suggestion? And I have trouble at the house, perfect internet, and then all of a sudden it pops up low bandwidth and everything freezes. So I'm in favor of this, but is there any way directly after you could send those of us who may have got froze out during the meeting, the full presentation, so we could review it just in case we miss anything? Because every virtual meeting I get on at some point, it freezes, nobody's moving, nobody's talking. And a lot of times I have to go out, go back in, and I've missed a good part of the meeting.
Yeah, that is one of the benefits of this, is that virtual meeting, we would record and live stream to YouTube like we do the advisory committee meetings now, and they're available immediately to people. Like as soon as I click the stop streaming button, you can go to the YouTube live stream and rewatch it. So you would be able to do that. And I believe that's all I have.
That's it. I'm in favor. I would like that. So we see this ahead of time, and then we're not discussing it as much. It's more getting public comment.
Would it be on the same day of the week, but a week earlier? Tell us how that works.
It probably wouldn't be the exact same day of the week. It actually potentially could be for y'all, since y'all are on a Wednesday. That's the middle of the week. Since the advisory committees typically are somewhat staggered, like we had the Northern last night, that it might not be exactly a week. It might be a week and a couple of days for one advisory committee, and maybe even a little more than that for some others. But we would try to give you at least a week to digest the information.
As long as it's not on a Monday night, I'm okay.
All right. Well, we can make sure it's not.
Because it could fall on a council meeting.
I think I have a preliminary schedule that I will email to y'all probably next week, and I have these dates as a Wednesday, so it'd most likely be a Wednesday. It might get depending on the specific meeting, it might be 1 or 2 days before or after, just if there's something that happens to fall on that day. That
6 o'clock.
Most likely, yes, sir. There is the potential for starting a little bit earlier if you want to. If the committees want to have more time to talk, just because, we love meeting and talking.
You'll have 3 committees there. I would think probably an hour or hour and a half ahead of time.
It would save time in travel. Like like tonight, there's a handful of you that might have to travel an hour or two back to your houses.
Tom.
Or even more than that, Tom.
A
So
lot longer.
thankfully, you wouldn't have to do that since it's a virtual meeting. And with that said, we would provide a listening station here, most likely at the CDO. So if you were having internet issues, you could come here and you probably want to see us in person anyway.
No action items in that meeting, virtual meeting.
No
No, sir.
votes, just questions, presentation and questions, that's it.
That's right. But with that said, it would be an official meeting of your committee. So it would count towards your attendance requirements. So if you skipped all of the virtual meetings, you likely wouldn't meet your 75% attendance requirement. So you should come to them. And I can try to come up with things to keep us here longer.
No,
I said it
no,
earlier
I'm
today.
ready to drop the gavel, but I don't have.
Yeah, vote on that.
I got a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
You got a
I got a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Hearing nothing, we're adjourned.
Hey, thanks, Jesse, and everyone for letting me participate remotely, and thanks for the biologists for being so well prepared.
Thank you, Fred. We really appreciate it.
God.
Safe drive. Go to my, I'm just going to.